Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. I, as always, am your host Simon, and welcome to the show. Today, it's Monday morning, so why don't we start? I mean, for me, I have no idea when you're listening to this. Why don't we start the week off with something fun? Was anything useful learned from World War II human experimentation? Brilliant. Decoding the Unknown, not normally something that goes this dark. Let's see how this episode does. I mean, financially, it's going to do terribly because no one is going to advertise on this video, so I guess this one's for free. You're welcome. If you see adverts, I'm getting paid, which is nice. Or if you're on YouTube Premium, I'm also getting paid, which is also nice. Let's jump into it, shall we? Thank you, George, for writing the episode. Going through what I'm about to go through. You're likely already aware that both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany implemented extensive programs of human experimentation during World War II, programs that, and there are no two ways about this, stand unchallenged as the darkest periods of medical history. Oh yeah, you'd be like, oh yeah, the Nazis, they were experimenting on people, and that Dr. Mengele and stuff, like doing all that weird shit. And then you learn about Unit 731, you're like, oh wow, there was a whole Asian equivalent of horror going on. So that's fun. And by fun, I mean fucking horrific. Conducted in camps, laboratories, and covert facilities across their occupied territories, those experiments saw thousands of men, women, and children subjected to torture so extreme that it can barely even be comprehended, never mind truly appreciated, and all of it was carried out with a veneer of supposed scientific rigor. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're gonna find out, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of this was just like mad scientists doing crazy shit. A persistent idea exists in the popular historical zeitgeist, however, and that is that these experiments, for all of their unmitigated horror and barbarism, actually advanced medical science, with some claiming that it did so significantly. George has put that in bold, all caps, underlined, and italics, so I guess I should read it as significantly, and others that it did so to only a small but still notable degree. And I bring this up now because recently I was reminded of this fact by, of all people, the formerly beloved and respected tech YouTuber, and now, well, not that, Boogie2988. Oh my god, yeah, this was, I don't know, this guy, I occasionally just hear about him from like YouTube videos that I watch. This guy seems to have gone a little bit off the rails or something. But yeah, he was a big deal, like, what, a decade ago? Maybe longer. Yeah, I think it was kind of before I got started on YouTube for sure. It was on one of his many silly comment compilations, you see, where he claimed that, quote, when you think about it, some good came from all of that. Health science was advanced many, many years. The Holocaust is horrible, but some good came from it. Dude, I mean, these are not words that should come out of your mouth, my dude. And this got me musing on the matter because it is a claim that you hear repeated with relative frequency in the historical space. So, big question, is it true? Well, hold that thought because I've been hitting the books, and in the next 2-ish hours, yeah, it's a big one, I'll be sharing everything I found with you. So let's get started. Just before we continue, a word from our wonderful sponsor today, and that is Vessi. Fall weather is unpredictable. Indeed. We call it autumn in the UK because we're fancy. Though it makes more sense, right? Because the leaves fall. I kind of get that. I kind of like fall. Every time of year is the perfect time for Vessi, but fall's around the corner, so it's extra time for Vessi because they make the most incredible waterproof shoes that you will ever wear. These are not water resistant. It's like not like, oh yeah, it's water resistant. You put your feet in a puddle and it's like, oh, it's a little bit damp on my socks, isn't it? No, Vessi is 100% waterproof. I mean, I guess they're not 100% because they got the hole in the top. Sorry, it's 100% waterproof. And that means like up to here, like up to the top. If the water's not going over the top, you're all good. And yeah, autumn, I mean, you can get some nice weather as well, right? But your feet won't sweat in these. I don't know how Dymatex works other than the fact that somehow fully waterproof, like Wellington boots or gum boots, rain boots, something like that, Americans. And it's just a great experience. They're also super comfortable. They're also super light. They got this great grip so you can go high. I went hiking this weekend in my Vessis, although I wore the non-hiking Vessis because that's what I had with me. I'm sorry, Vessi. Next time, I'll go properly and I'll wear my Stormbursts. The Vessi Stormburst, like I said, is 100% waterproof. It's got that serious grip. It's super light. It's cushioned. It's comfortable. It's everything you need on a hike. Also, just if you're in the city, it's pouring with rain outside right now. So I'll probably slip this brand new pair of Vessis on before I leave the office. Plus, they also make socks and all sorts of stuff. Check out the website. If you want to be ready for any terrain, rain or shine, try the Vessi Stormburst today. 100% waterproof, backed by a 1-year warranty, and it's risk-free with 30-day returns. Shop now at vessi.com/unknown and you'll get 15% off your first pair. And now back to today's video. The Nazi experiments. 2 hours of misery. Actually, you know what? I used to present and work on a channel called Today I Found Out, and I don't think of the thousands of videos we made, there was one where I was just like, it was just a deep dive into this, and I was just reading it, and I was like, I mean, George knows, like, my thoughts on, like, not gore. Gore makes it sound like it's fictional, but just, like, human horror. And I mean, the other show I do, Casual Criminalist, right? I'm always saying, like, I'd like it to be more CSI and less Saw. Like, less descriptions of people having their head chopped off, and instead, they were decapitated. Like, I much prefer that. And I think to the show, that show's detriment to some points, because some people who watch true crime or listen to true crime shows, they just want that, and I just don't like it. So George knows this, but when I was working on that today, I found out the writer who put that script together, I was just like, oh my God, I'm done. Like, I was reading it and I was just like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm just not. It's too fucking much. Of all the thousands, I think that was the one I rejected. I was just like, nope, not happening. Okay, but before we can get into the was of the matter, we must first have a right and proper going over the what of the matter. Because if we're going to weigh the supposed scientific value of this data and by extension wrestle with the gut-churning question of whether any of it should be used, then we need to be crystal clear on exactly how that data was obtained. The methods matter, the context matter, the victims matter. It's all too easy to slip into abstract debates about ethics or utility if you lose sight of the human cost. And so, therefore, before we even think about what may have been learned, we're going to walk through what was done in all its cold clinical horror and deserved details so that when we reach the crux of the matter later on, we'll be able to do so with our eyes wide open. All right, George, well, I hope we're not going to get too much into the gory details and more just like a scientific breakdown, please. And if it does get too grim, I'm probably going to filter it as we go, because all of this stuff was obviously extremely horrible, but it doesn't mean we need to, like, relitigate it in detail to be aware of the horror. I think we're all pretty familiar with how fucking horrible it was. And in doing so, allow me to begin by asking you to imagine for a moment the cold, clinical tiles of a Nazi laboratory that doubles as a torture chamber. A prisoner, once a living, breathing person with a family and a name, is now strapped to a table or submerged in ice water, surrounded by men in white coats atop their SS uniforms, needles, scalpels, stopwatches in hand. These Nazi doctors hover like curious vultures. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was reality in 1942, deep inside Dachau concentration camp. There, and more tragically still, across the Third Reich's vast network of camps more broadly, some of Germany's most highly educated physicians plied their warped and perverted craft, a once noble trade that had been corrupted and fouled into an instrument of unbridled wickedness. Yeah, these are doctors. And what's that? Not the Pledge of Allegiance. Why is that what first came to mind? The Hippocratic Oath. Yeah, like, guys, it's an oath. You should maybe stick by them. As for a proper example of what their experiments could entail, consider the Luftwaffe physicians at Dachau. Chief among them was Dr. Sigmund Rascher, an SS doctor ambitious to impress Heinrich Himmler. He had a laboratory-grade, low-pressure chamber delivered to Dachau, basically a big steel capsule that could simulate high-altitude environments. And so it was the prisoners found themselves locked inside with air being pumped out to mimic altitudes of up to 66,000 feet. That, for reference, is both more than double the height of Mount Everest and a smidge under the cruising altitude of a U-2 spy plane. That'd be the one where the crew had to wear a spacesuit in order to stay alive. From there, and according to documents later presented at the Nuremberg trials, Rascher would then watch through a portal as the victim's oxygen dwindled, typically around atmospheres equivalent to 30 or 40,000 feet, which is about how high a plane flies, a commercial jet. The victim would begin to lose consciousness and soon enough start to thrash in panic as their blood literally started to boil in the low pressure. This horrifying effect, known as ebullition, occurs when the surrounding pressure drops so low that bodily fluids begin to vaporize at normal body temperature. This is similar to what happens if you're in space and you go outside, your blood starts boiling in your body. While blood inside the circulatory system is kept under pressure and doesn't immediately boil, exposed fluids like those in the lungs, eyes, or mouth can begin to bubble violently, causing excruciating pain, tissue damage, and inevitably death. And just in case the indignity wrought upon them during their passing wasn't enough, oftentimes they would be afforded no grace in death either, as Rascher was wont to throw them straight onto the dissection table before their body was even cold. His reason for doing so? Well, he wanted to see if his experiment had produced any interesting results. He was just a man of science, after all, or so he claimed. I mean, you can be interested in science, but you can also, I don't think that is untrue. He's a man of science. Sure, he's also a fucking monster, and should realize that this is beyond the pale of acceptability. Shockingly too, many of the victims actually did not die in the chamber. As of the 200 people who believed to have been subjected to it, 120 of them actually survived the ordeal. They were given a brief once-over to assess their condition, and then, having outlived their usefulness as forced guinea pigs, they were taken aback and shot, partly to cover up the evidence, but also because the experiments always left them so broken that they'd never be able to use as a slave laborer again. Having heard all of that, you're likely wondering what he was actually trying to learn, or at least what it was claimed that he wanted to learn while satisfying an evidently broken and warped set of moral principles. I imagine he's wanting to learn about, the UT spy plane, whether people need to be in spacesuits and stuff like that in order to survive those kind of altitudes. The obvious answer is fucking yes. What the fuck? Well, officially, the Luftwaffe wanted to help its pilots survive high-altitude bailouts, and by conducting those experiments, Rascher was supposedly building up a body of data that either he or someone else would be able to use to start thinking of solutions. And they did legitimately have that need. It's worth pointing out the human body can typically manage up to about 8,000 feet without much issue, but beyond that, the air gets thin enough that performance starts to degrade. By around 12,000 feet, oxygen deprivation can impair thinking and cause fatigue. By 18,000 feet, you're dealing with serious hypoxia, and by 25,000 feet, often called the death zone, unconsciousness can set in within minutes without supplemental oxygen. Is it the dude from Veritasium who did this? Jesus Christ, not this, obviously, but he went into, I can't remember what it was him. It was one of these educational YouTubers who goes out and does experiments. And he went into a high altitude simulation where they're taking him up and they're like, okay, take off the mask. And he takes off the oxygen mask and he's feeling pretty fine. And they're asking him these questions. They're trying to, he's like, okay, put the square peg in the square hole and the circular peg in the circular hole or whatever. I'm misremembering this entirely, but the point stands. And he's doing fine. And then very quickly, he's like, oh, he can't work out which the square peg goes in. He's like, oh no, I can't do it. And he's not worried about this. He's just completely fine. He's like, oh yeah, no, I can't figure it out. Look at that. How weird is that? I can't do it. And then the person who's sitting in the chamber with him with the mask on, the instructor or whatever, is like, yo, you got to put the mask on because clearly you're not functioning right and you are going to die. And he's like, yeah, I guess I could do that, couldn't I? And he doesn't put the mask on. And the guy eventually has to go over to him and put the mask on. And it's just insane, how quickly you just become utterly incompetent without oxygen. And it's not like that underwater where you're feeling the pain in your lungs and you're like, oh, I gotta breathe, I gotta get up to the surface. Because that's not oxygen deprivation. That's a buildup of carbon dioxide in your body becoming uncomfortable. And that's not what happens at high altitude. You just start to lose cognitive function extremely quickly. It's why when, they say, always put your mask on first when they drop down if the cabin depressurizes in an airplane, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to put it on anyone else. You're not going to be, if your kid's sitting there and you put it on them first, then you're going to not be able to work out how to put it on. Whereas you can put yours on, get that oxygen, and then you can put it on your kids or someone else who's struggling. You've got to put it on first. By 18,000 feet, you're dealing with severe hypoxia, and by 25,000 feet, often called the death zone, unconsciousness can set in within minutes without supplemental oxygen. Yeah, and impaired thinking faster than that. And the Luftwaffe were really brushing up against those limits. Aircraft like the Focke-Wulf TA-152 and the Henschel Ace HS-130 were designed to operate at altitudes of 40 or even 50,000 feet. So yes, there was a military rationale on paper, and that, as far as Rascher was concerned, allowed him to totally wash his hands of the morality of the matter. To him, the living beings he was forcing into the chamber, literally at gunpoint, pulled from the inmate population of a concentration camp, had all the innate value of the microbes he'd pushed around in petri dishes while at university. To see what I mean about his utilitarian disregard for the lives of those deemed unworthy by the National Socialist creed, consider nice avoidance of the word that'll get us demonetized there, George, but I don't think monetization is happening today. Consider the 1942 medical conference, Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter. As there, he stood up with all the detached chill of a man describing cattle yields rather than corpses, presented charts, photographs, and time of death tables drawn from men he had personally killed. The room was filled with doctors, educated men, and not one of them reportedly got up and walked out. Rascher spoke without flinching about human beings rendered insensate and limp, and about the point at which life extinguished in their eyes. He spoke, in short, as if the people he murdered were merely entries in a logbook. That also segues us nicely to our next point, because as you likely guessed from the name of that conference, he wasn't presenting the findings of his low-pressure experiments there. No, he was presenting the findings of another study that he carried out, one in which he froze inmates to death in tubs of ice. You see, by mid-1942, with the Nazi war machine fighting in the bitter Soviet winter and pilots crashing into the icy North Sea, High Command wanted answers on hypothermia. So, once again, Dachau prisoners became human guinea pigs. As for what Rascher did specifically, in the blazing Bavarian summer, he constructed big tubs of ice water in the camp, and in went the victims to simulate downed pilots. They would be forced to remain in there for various lengths of time, suffering in agony, as to allow Rascher and his team to gather a big spread of data, with various variables thrown in for good measure, or which could be being stripped totally naked or being donned in either a standard-issue Luftwaffe flight suit or some other experimental material or costume they wanted to see the impact of, all the while Rascher and his colleagues took note on clipboards with the same detached curiosity they'd shown during the high-altitude experiments. Eventually, with the how long it takes someone to die question seemingly having been satisfactorily solved, they then moved on to questions of what exactly is the point of unrecoverability and what can be done to bring someone back from the brink of death. These rewarming experiments, as they were called, saw victims exposed to extreme cold as per the norm, and then have various methods tried to afford recovery. And these methods were often just as, if not more, brutal than the cold exposure, with being dunked into a vat of literally boiling water, conscious or not, being one of the most extreme methods tried. Guys, at that point, what are you doing? You know it's not going to help. You know that that's just going to... I mean, just... What? I mean, I'm not like someone who strongly wants to advocate for animal testing, but you know what's going to happen. Why are you doing it on people? I don't know, it's because they don't see these as people. Fucking psychos. The most weird method, however, well, that was actually the brainchild of Himmler himself. Since Rascher had been so eager to impress the man, he naturally had started to CC him in once results of the experiments began to come in. Himmler liked what he read, and so soon enough he was the de facto patron and sponsor of the whole effort. Therefore he, with his complete lack of any medical or scientific background, he was a farmer by trade, actually, came to have decision-making power in the experiments. As for the frankly peculiar thing he suggested, that would be what he called an animal heat method of rewarming, i.e. sandwiching the half-dead victim between two women and seeing if that somehow made them recover from deathly cold. And yes, that experiment was always done with a man in the middle and women on the outside. Read into that what you will, as you'll likely be correct. It's just bizarre. This is not science. There is, however, a tiny, tiny slither of a silver lining of joy to be found at the end of Rascher's story, however, and it comes in the form of a somewhat sweet and fatal irony. Because, you know his whole trying to rim Himmler's arse shtick? Well, Rascher flew too close to the sun, and like Icarus, he found his wings melted and himself plunging into the void below. Please tell me that the sweet end to this story is that he dies horribly being tortured to death by Himmler. Long story short, ever more desperate for results that he could wave under the Reichsfuhrer's SS nose, he ended up progressing from just committing heinous science to straight up making shit up. Shocking that a man such as him wasn't more committed to scholarly rigor, I know. As for what he made up, that'd be the fact that he, a man whose willy had long since checked out of the game due to his age, had managed to father some children. He straight up called them miracle births too, a la Jesus style. That's just how much of an Aryan Superman he was, you see. What is going on? They were, in reality, however, kidnapped babies, which his wife had stolen from local maternity hospitals. What is wrong with you? Have I never heard of you, Rasher? You sound like, honestly, the problem is any other point in history, this guy would be like one of the most sick fucks that you'd ever heard of. And he'd be, featured on true crime podcasts like ones I do, along with, fucking Harold Shipman. And the idea that Shipman was doing anything nearly as bad as this and is regarded as, and rightfully so, one of the biggest mass murderers in history. And then there's this dude who's just, forgotten in a mass of psychos. It's just crazy, isn't it? It's just a crazy, crazy time in history. He pulled this scam in 1944 and was rumbled in 1945, after which he was arrested by the Gestapo at the personal insistence of Himmler. And this is where it gets really ironic, because do you know where they sent him? Yep, they sent him to Dachau concentration camp, the very institute of evil where he had crafted his own personal house of horrors. Now, on the other side of the razor wire, he got to enjoy about 3 weeks of the conditions he had no small part in creating before being dragged out and shot by the SS men he formerly called his colleagues and friends on the 26th of April, 3 days before the camps were liberated by the Americans. Oh no! Anyway, never thought I'd be happy to see someone chucked into a concentration camp, folks, but hey, couldn't have happened to a more deserving C-word. I completely agree, George. It's not often that I'd use the C-word, but I'd absolutely use it. This is demonetized anyway. I'm not going to risk it. It's just not worth it. But this guy is absolutely worthy of it. There's a double layer of irony in this too, because you know how Himmler wasn't exactly chuffed to find out that Rasher had been kidnapping kids? Well, Himmler himself had also been doing exactly that, and on an industrial scale via the Lebensborn program, an SS scheme tasked with increasing the Aryan population by any means necessary. The kidnapping of genetically suitable children from occupied territories included. Such hypocrisy, I'm starting to think that these Nazis just might be the bad guys.
Hans, are we the baddies?
Oh my god, the fact that there's, I don't know, for some reason you hear it on social media today, Kanye West being oh yeah, Nazis, wee! Or it's why, what's going on? Guys, do you not remember? There's no way you could look at this and be this is okay. There's no, I guess the problem is they'll be oh, it didn't happen. And I'm oh, for fuck's sake. Despite the overwhelming amounts of evidence, it is fucking historical fact. Shut the fuck up. Oh, and it's worth saying that even Nazis themselves began to consider Rasher as a crank and a pseudoscientific fraud. Well, yeah, because he was a fraud. For example, in 1942, the Nordgemeinschaft der Deutschen Wissenschaft, yikes, a research funding organization, uncovered that a 1936 to 1938 cancer test Rasher had conducted and lauded as a spectacular breakthrough in treatment had yielded results that were totally unreproducible, meaning that in all likelihood they were fabricated. Given that this breakthrough had been the foundation upon which much of his later career had been built, this had dire repercussions for him going forward. Oh no! For example, he was scouting for a lecturing gig in 1943, and not a single university in all of Nazi Germany and its occupied territories did even so much as humor him. His name had become nothing short of poisonous. Can't we just fucking throw him in the camp already and take him outside and shoot him? Why is there this delay? And while much of the documentation related to this effort didn't survive the war, some did, and so I'm specifically able to name one Professor Wilhelm Pfannerstiel of Marburg University as one of the many people who pied him off, stating that he, quote, did not want Rasher to habilitate with him, a position that he maintained even when Himmler tried to charm him into changing his minds. When Himmler in Nazi Germany is telling you to do something, you're no, that guy's such a piece of shit, no way. Well, one, that takes balls, and also good for fucking you. Bear in mind that Pfannerstiel was quite an enthusiastic Nazi himself. Oh no, did I just describe that guy as having big balls and good for him, and he turns out he's an enthusiastic Nazi. Fuck. His refusal wasn't even some kind of secret resistance kind of deal. Similarly, the Sanitätsstufe at the medical department of the Luftwaffe also ended up turning on him. Partly this was due to his wider discrediting, but it wasn't entirely, because what was the harm in humoring a nutter on the off chance that he yielded some useful results? It wasn't like they cared about the human suffering caused in the process, was it? What really sealed the deal for them, instead, was the fact that Rasher, for some reason, ended up totally cutting them out of the loop concerning his trials. You know, the trials that were supposedly being done for their benefit. He's off on his own little fucking adventure, isn't he? His own little sick, twisted adventure. Between those two factors, They totally wrote him off as a crank and pulled all support, although they did reluctantly continue working with him again when Himmler redirected his charm offensive onto them, at which point it became easier to pretend like they cared, just to make him shut up. Even Rascher's one-time mentor, Dr. George Welz, turned against him, feuding over credit and slamming Rascher's use of human test subjects. I would say good for you, but I'm probably going to find out that this guy was an enthusiastic Nazi in a second, so I'll hold off judgment. Not that Wells cared about using them full stop, however. Oh no, he only cared that Rascher had poached the best subjects for himself, and that's why I didn't do it this time. I learned my lesson. Fucking psycho-Nazi scientists. Not all Nazi camp experiments, however, came courtesy of unhinged cranks like Rascher chasing glory. Some came from the upper crust of the Reich's medical elite, men who in another timeline might have spent their lives healing the sick or lecturing in spotless halls. Instead, in the actual timeline that we got, they put their talents towards perfecting the art of torture under the pretext of medical advancement. Case in point, the 1944 seawater experiments at Dachau. This time, the question wasn't how high or cold, but how thirsty. Picture the scene. A Luftwaffe pilot is shot down over the Atlantic. He's bobbing about in a raft surrounded by miles of undrinkable water. The Reich, sensing a genuine problem, wants to know, can seawater be made safe to drink? I mean, yes, absolutely. You've got to take the salt out of it, though. It's called a solar still. Enter Dr. Hans Eppinger, a once respected liver specialist to Europe's elite, and Dr. Wilhelm Beigelbach, a Luftwaffe physician whose ambition outweighed his ethics. Together, they turned Dachau into a laboratory for slow, calculated dehydration. And so it was that roughly 90 prisoners, mostly Roman men, were selected for the trials. Some were given untreated seawater and nothing else. Others got a chemically treated version dubbed the Burka method. No food, no fresh water, just salt and sun until the body gave out. Their tongues swelled, their skin cracked, some licked the floor clean for traces of mop water. Others chewed on rags or drank their own urine. One inmate, Joseph Chofenig, who worked in the camp infirmary, later recalled the prisoners would suck condensation from windows like dying animals. Their organs began to fail. Some couldn't even swallow by the end. Yeah, I mean, to the fucking surprise of no one, that's what happens when you drink seawater. And through it all, there was Beigelbach, calmly taking notes, measuring weight loss, jotting down blood sodium levels with the composure of someone testing beakers in a lab, not humans in a hellhole. This study ran from late July to early September 1944, and by its end, many of the subjects were so withered and delirious that they couldn't stand, speak, or eat. Again, not exactly surprising, is it, Doc? Unsurprisingly, many died. Beigelbach, however, claimed later, under oath no less, that nobody died directly from the experiment, a line that, if you'll pardon some speculation, must have sounded better in his head than it did in court. Oh, please tell me they hung him. So he went to Nuremberg, I guess, and come on, tell me they hung him. The damage, of course, was permanent. Autopsies conducted afterward, well, yeah, autopsy, death tends to be permanent, revealed internal organs so damaged that they were described as shriveled. One prisoner's liver, for instance, reportedly looked like it had been left in the sun for a week. And if you're wondering what became of them, Dr. Eppinger, the mastermind of that exercise in calculated cruelty, didn't live to face trial. With the war collapsing around him and presumably sensing his story was destined to end with a righteous absolution of a short, sharp drop if he was captured, he ended his life on his own terms in 1945, and I think, again, we'll just say, oh no. Although it is kind of disappointing that he didn't get to go to trial and then be hung. But I'm glad he died early and killed himself. Fuck that guy. Beigelbach, on the other hand, was arrested and stood trial at Nuremberg in 1947. His defense consisted of 2 points. A, that the ends justified the means. Good luck with that one, mate. And B, people like Rascher have been far worse, so cut a man some slack. He was like, yeah, dude, I'm not that bad. Look at Hitler. Look at Hitler. He was regional. We should just punish him, no one else. I was about to use a word I shouldn't say there, but it's an R-word, an argument. That's what it is. Shockingly, that defense worked, and he served a mere 5 years in prison. Oh, God, that's really terrible. But also, I bet Dr. Eppinger in his grave is like, oh, fuck. And if you thought that was the end of the Reich's medical depravity, allow me to disappoint you, because while Eppinger and Beigelbach were killing Roma men through forced dehydration, over at Ravensbrück concentration camp, a different set of doctors had their own twisted research agenda, cutting open healthy young women and infecting their wounds with disease, all to test antibiotics. This was the sulfonamide program. Now, on paper, it was meant to test the efficacy of sulfur drugs, one of the world's first antibiotics. In reality, however, It was a carefully orchestrated horror show. The victims were Polish women, mostly in their 20s, resistance fighters, students, patriots, and the like. They weren't picked for medical reasons. They were picked because they were expendable. The Nazis called them volunteers, of course, because everything sounds better when you lie about it. I mean, not joking, but it does. And I think if the war had turned out differently, this bit of history would be glossed over as people were volunteering themselves for the good of the Reich. And would be like, for the good of the Reich! Please don't clip that. But I think that is what history would look like if it had turned out differently. Obviously, it's not true. But the propaganda machine would have spun it up that way. The operation was overseen by Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician. His assistants included Dr. Fritz Fischer and Dr. Herta Oberhauser, the latter of whom would go on to become the only woman tried at the 46 through 47 doctors' trial at Nuremberg, a specific sub-trial of the wider Nuremberg effort that dealt specifically with medical crimes. I feel also this is like particularly bad. You think, oh, medical crimes, this is kind of like less than maybe the SS officer sending people to the gas chamber. But in a way, doctors should be held to a higher standard than your fucking SS officer because they've taken an oath to do no harm. Their whole being should be around healing people and protecting people, and instead, they were torturing people and murdering people. I think that this is worse than the SS officer sending people to the gas chambers because you're torturing people to death, essentially, and you have people who you have a duty of care towards. The procedure went like this. First, they would surgically slice into a woman's leg and then pack the wound with every disgusting thing they could find. Dirt from campgrounds, bits of rusty nails, splinters of glass, and bacteria cultures scraped from lab dishes, particularly things like Streptococcus, Clostridium perfringens, and tetanus. They'd then tie off blood flow and sew it up, and wait for the swelling, for the fever, for the rot. Some of the women were treated with sulfur, others weren't. Some received only placebos. A few were operated on multiple times. One woman, Jadwiga Kaminska, who had been part of the placebo group, later testified that her leg oozed pus for months after they'd treated her. She wasn't given pain relief. She wasn't even told why they were doing it. When she was asked, an SS guard told her coldly, "Because you are a Polish patriot," which under Nazi logic was reason enough. Right, yeah. Volunteers. Dr. Oberhauser was particularly fond of telling women they should feel honored to be contributing to medical science. Honored, as if being used like lab rabbits and left to rot on a straw mattress was some sort of noble calling. And speaking of rabbits, that's what the women came to call themselves. A bitter joke was that they were rabbits of Ravensbrück, and they knew exactly what that meant. And for that team, sadly the sulfur trials weren't enough, because right alongside the infection experiments, they also conducted another far more medieval one. What more medieval than packing rusty nails into someone's cut open leg and seeing what happens? This was a mutilation experiment. The idea, purportedly, was to explore the regeneration of bones, muscles, and nerves for wounded German soldiers, but in practice this meant hacking chunks out of living women just to see what would happen. The same supply, their word, not mine, of female Polish prisoners was used. And as for what was done to them, surgeons would saw out several centimeters of leg bone, remove sections of muscle, or sever nerves, things like that. And then they made notes on what happened to them, over what length of time, and what difference certain variables made. Anesthesia was also used sparingly, if at all. Some victims woke up screaming, and many never woke up at all. The results for those who did live? Legs that shrank and twisted, limbs left permanently limp, numbness, gangrene, sepsis. Survivors were often left with one leg shorter than the other, making walking or even standing agonizing. Some had to learn how to balance on crutches, hobbling around the camp with their mangled bodies. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a slow dismantling of human beings. I had nerve damage in my hand once, from cycling, and it was the most minor thing you could possibly imagine. But I couldn't open this part of my hand, like this, and it was for months, and it was really like uncomfortable and annoying, and I'm like, but imagine that times 1,000 as they've severed it, so you can't open it again, or they've cut out bones and all of this stuff, and I'm just like, it's just fucking barbaric. And if you're wondering whether this was done to advance science or punish Polish resistance fighters, well, even the Nazis didn't bother pretending very hard. The phrase, "you are our enemies, so we can do to you whatever we like," was said aloud more than once, for example. This was after World War I, where they established, proper rules for modern warfare. So they know that this is not right. They know this is illegal. Remarkably, many of the rabbits survived. They documented their injuries in secret. They smuggled out messages, even photographs, and when the Nazis tried to kill them all in early 1945 to destroy the evidence before the Red Army arrived, fellow prisoners hid them in false walls, under floorboards, anywhere they could. When the Soviets finally liberated the camp, the rabbits were still alive, and they were furious. After the war, however, the rabbits would finally get their day. At the doctor's trial, they stood in the same room as the people who'd carved them up and spoke their truth. Women like Jadwiga Kaminska took the stand, rolled up their sleeves, sometimes literally to demonstrate their wounds, and confronted their tormentors with cold, steady rage. They didn't flinch. The doctors did, with none of them managing to be quite so arrogant as they once had been now that the shoe was on the other foot. Yeah, but it will never be on the other foot properly, will it? It's not like they're cutting their nerves, sawing their bones out, using anesthesia sparingly, Jesus. Dr. Gebhardt tried to defend himself by saying the sulfur experiments were necessary. Right, sure, but that doesn't mean that the ethics don't apply. He claimed he was trying to prove that sulfonidamides wouldn't have saved Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's third man, who died of sepsis in 1942 after an assassination attempt. That doesn't make it fucking necessary, Gebhardt. You idiot. Gebhardt, you see, hadn't used sulfur on him, and Himmler had questioned that choice. So, in what might be the most appallingly cynical act of professional self-preservation in medical history, Gebhardt decided to infect dozens of Polish girls with gangrene to prove a point about a dead Nazi's treatment plan. Or so his rather poorly thought-out defense plan claimed anyway. Fortunately, it didn't work. The tribunal saw through it, and Gebhardt was sent to Dangle in 1948. Oh no! Fritz Fischer, his right-hand man, got life in prison. He was out in 10 years and later went back to work in the pharmaceutical industry, because why would a megacorporation ever let anything as trivial as a crime against humanity get in the way of the sacred growth line of its continual going up? I mean, yeah, honestly here, I'm not holding the pharmaceutical company to account for this. Companies, they're not good, they're not evil, they are just profit-driven. The responsibility here lies on a government, which you'd expect, or I would like to hope, maybe naively, would draw a fucking line and be like, no. Or people would be like, no, I'm not buying your drugs. But that doesn't happen. And therefore this happens. The right thing to have done, put that guy in fucking prison forever, or send him for a short drop. And then there was Herta Oberhauser. You remember her, the only woman on trial, the one who told her patients they should be honored, and the one who ignored pleas for help and let wounds fester until they were oozing and pestilent. She got 20 years, and much like Fisher, was out in 5 years. If this person was on casual criminal list as a regular criminal operating in peacetime, they would be taken to the fucking chair. Like, without question. By 1956, she was back in West Germany practicing as a family doctor. All right, how the fuck? Strip her of a medical license. I don't understand. How does she still have a medical license? People get stripped of their medical license all the time for shitty behavior. What's going on? I don't know about all the time. But people get their medical licenses taken away, and I cannot think of a better example of someone who should have it taken away. You go to prison for a medical crime, default, take your medical license away. Eventually, however, she was at least denied that liberty, as one of her former victims just happened to walk into her practice in 1958, and after an ensuing media shitstorm of barely discernible proportions, the state revoked her license in 1958. Excellent. Fucking too late, though. How about this? Anyone who was on trial at Nuremberg and found guilty should not be allowed to practice medicine. Doesn't seem that complicated, does it? Then she vanished from the public eye and died abandoned and alone in an old folks' home in 1978. Oh no! Anyway, and now diseases. Because the Nazis never wanted to leave a category of cruelty unexplored, they deliberately infected prisoners with everything from malaria to typhus, tuberculosis, and hepatitis. Really anything and everything that they thought might be useful for protecting their own troops, or more simply, just feeding their twisted curiosity. Well, let's start with malaria. Enter Dr. Klaus Schilling, a tropical disease expert in his 70s. He took up residence at Dachau in 1942 and essentially transformed an entire section of the camp into his own personal malariology institute. He wasn't picky about his subjects either: priests, political prisoners, whoever was available, and of course, as it never was, consent was not sought even once. From there, he selected prisoners who were either bitten by infected mosquitoes or injected directly with plasmodium-laced blood. Then, once the fevers kicked in, the treatments began. Schilling tested various drugs, atropine, quinine, whatever was on hand, on some patients, and others, the control group, were simply left to ride it out. He charted every fever spike, every seizure, every descent into delirium, all with the calm detachment of a man conducting a weather study instead of watching someone die of organ failure. Roughly 1,000 prisoners were used. About half died outright or were executed when they became too weak to be of further use. The rest were released back into the camp population as medical wreckage, shivering and sweating in cycles, destined to relapse again and again. Yeah, because malaria stays with you, right? Does it go in your bones? I think it goes in your bones, and then it can just come back and strike. And still, despite the abject horror of it all, Schilling insisted that his work was noble. He was, in his mind, a humanitarian doing essential research for the good of mankind. The Dachau military tribunal run by the US disagreed, however, and he was sent to hang in 1946. Yes, please. And now, typhus. The Nazis wanted a vaccine, you see, mostly for their troops. As in particularly bogged down and drawn out engagements, think the siege of Leningrad or the Battle of Stalingrad, it really went through their numbers, which didn't exactly do wonders for their strategic situation. Further, they also really wanted one to roll out in the concentration camps, as, owing to their rather less than sanitary conditions at best and downright putrid conditions at worst, they were riddled with it. Typhus is actually what most historians believe to have been Anne Frank's cause of death in the end too. If you wanted a specific example, with her being just one of 17,000 suspected deaths from an early 1945 epidemic that swept through the camp. Isn't it insane that 17,000, you read the number and you're like, oh yeah, but I mean, that's a rounding error in a concentration camp, which is insane. 17,000 people. Oh, and it probably doesn't need saying too, but just to be safe, obviously the Nazis didn't want the vaccine for the inmates. They couldn't have given two shits about them. It was the staff who worked in close proximity to them that they wanted to protect. Oh, for a minute I was like, maybe it was earlier in the war and they were protecting their slave labor. But no, it was later in the war and they just didn't care. As for where the vaccine trial occurred, that would be Buchenwald, specifically in Block 46, the camp's infamous isolation wing. Led by SS Dr. Erwin Ding-Schuler, the trial saw hundreds of prisoners, a mix of Soviet POWs, political enemies, and Jews, be either vaccinated with experimental formulas or left unvaccinated as controls. And then, they were all deliberately infected, some with blood drawn from actively infected, alive prisoners, and others with dosages made from the pulverized organs of prisoners who had already fallen to the disease. The results were about as horrific as you'd expect. Typhus set in. Fever spiked to 40 degrees Celsius, patients vomited, hallucinated, broke out in rashes and slipped into stupor. Many died choking on their own blood, and those that survived were often left permanently, but briefly debilitated. Briefly, because of course with them no longer having use as slave laborers, the survivors were killed and disposed of once the trial was completed. Ding Schuer's team also kept neat little charts tracking who lived, who died, and what the vaccine batch number was. For once, however, not all the staff were on board. I'm not entirely sure what sort of person could stomach working as a cog in industrialized genocide, but draw a line and infected their victims with typhus, but such was the situation. Led by Dr. Zygmunt Mazur, this group of suddenly scrupled staff members would swap out live typhus samples with dead ones in at least one instance that historians have been able to verify, likely saving at least a dozen lives or so. Their small act of resistance, however, while no doubt eternally appreciated by those it did save, did little to change the overall picture, as for every one they did save, a further 10 minimum would still die. I mean, at least they did something. As for Ding Schuler, he professed his innocence until the very end, as we know from his surviving diaries, claiming that his work had been for the greater good. Wait, so is he protesting his innocence? I mean, that's like, no, I did it, but I think it was right, which is not a defense. Short drop, please! His actions, however, spoke louder than words, because when the Americans rolled in to Buchenwald, he opted to hang himself rather than try their justification in court. In his place, an assistant, one Dr. Waldemar Hoven, was tried instead and went to the rope in 1948. Excellent. And because nothing screams scientific rigor quite like discharging poison gas onto forced victims, our next stop is Natzweiler Struthof, the only concentration camp built on French soil. There. I feel like my, knowledge of the Second World War is pretty decent from all the various videos I made about it. I did not know that there was a concentration camp on French soil. I guess it shouldn't surprise me, I've just not heard of it. There, the Nazis decided to trial phosgene gas, a suffocating agent that had been all the rage on the battlefields of World War I. They pumped it into sealed chambers filled with prisoners to try and get exact and precise data on exactly how, when, and in what concentrations it killed people. Roughly 50 prisoners were selected, mostly Roma, transferred in from Auschwitz, and they were exposed to controlled phosgene concentrations inside airtight chest chambers. Many didn't realize they were breathing a lethal agent until their lungs began to fill with fluid. Some died inside the chamber. Others were dragged out, observed for scientific curiosity's sake, and then executed so their damaged organs could be dissected. The man overseeing this horror was Dr. Otto Birkenbach, and he didn't stop at phosgene. He also repeated his wicked experiments with mustard gas. These are things that were specifically banned. And now they're not just using them in war, they are using them on innocent civilians in experimentation. Although with that, the experiment was not in gathering data on lethality, but in trialing experimental treatments, particularly for the rather horrific blistering that mustard gas caused on the skin. Wait. They're like, how are we going to figure this out, how to treat it? Oh, we'll give it to people first, and then we'll treat what we gave them. What the fuck? To do this, he'd strip prisoners naked, smear them half in whatever compound he wanted to trial, and then let mustard gas have at them in limited dosages, with him specifically wanting to keep them alive, at least initially, so they could report on their perception of pain and intensity of symptoms. Many, however, still died during the trial itself, as even a small amount of mustard gas can prove lethal under the right physiological conditions, and either way, when all was done, any survivors were shot anyway, so that they could be dissected. And now to mix things up, the next medically dressed torture I have to tell you about was more surreal. You see, having thoroughly explored the body, the Nazis wanted to turn their attention to the mind, specifically to whether or not it could be chemically cracked open. Oh, not literally, we're talking like truth serum or something, right? And so it was that at Dachau, SS doctors, chief among them Dr. Kurt Plottner, began dabbling with mescaline, a hallucinogenic compound extracted from peyote. The goal? To find a truth serum, something to make prisoners spill secrets, confess sabotage, or simply collapse into a puddle of actionable intelligence. I think we know this doesn't work, right? And in a marked change of pace from what else I've discussed, this experiment was actually conducted covertly, with the victims typically having the mescaline slipped into their drinks, with onlooking guards then being ordered to bring them in once it had kicked in, that moment supposedly being quite apparently evident to even just a guard thanks to the radically different temperament it quickly brought to the fore. Yeah, that's what happens when you give someone fucking mescaline. By doing it this way, Plottner reasoned that their reactions would be genuine and circumvent any chance of victims' awareness changing how strongly the drug took hold of them. And as for what the victims actually did when laced, some wept, some laughed, others became paranoid or slipped into mute, terrified silence. A few, apparently, did talk, but not in any way that made sense. Plottner himself noted that the results were chaotic at best and mostly just left the victims in prolonged states of fear and disorientation. That said, the fact that it didn't work didn't stop the trials from continuing, because of course it didn't. After the war, Plottner simply fell off the face of the earth, and it was widely assumed that he'd died. In reality, he was living under a new name still in Germany, and was just practicing civilian medicine hidden in plain sight. Do note, some sources claimed that he was being protected by the Americans, as the then nascent CIA was interested in building upon his findings for their own purposes. But, and I cannot stress this enough, I did not find this claim repeated in a single scholarly work that I would actually confidently trust, so please take that claim with a large pinch of salt. Yeah, okay, I mean, maybe not. Lack of evidence, I don't think that's the case unless we can prove it, right? Otherwise it just is made up. Meanwhile, back in the camps, the focus shifted once again, this time to sterilization. If the Nazis couldn't work people to death, shoot them, gas them, freeze them, or infect them, then the next best thing in their eyes was to make sure that they couldn't have children. And so an experiment to figure out the most effective way to do so was undertaken. It happened at Auschwitz, and the work was led primarily by two men, Dr. Horst Schumann and Dr. Karl Klauberg. Both approached the matter from different angles, but with the same underlying goal: render the undesirable populations infertile quickly, cheaply, and without fuss. Schumann's method of choice was X-rays. Now prisoners were brought into small examination rooms and ordered to stand, trousers down, while targeted radiation was blasted at their genitals. They were told it was a routine health check. It wasn't until the skin started burning and their testicles swelled and split that they realized otherwise. After a few days, they were castrated so the damage could be inspected, measured, and written up. Job done. Klauberg, on the other hand, preferred a more hands-on approach. He focused on women injecting caustic chemicals directly into their cervixes with the aim of scarring the fallopian tubes shut. There was no anesthetic. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Infections were common. Some women collapsed on the spot, some died. The rest were left sterilized, maimed, and utterly broken. Many of them, when asked what happened, were simply told, "You've been cured," before being hurried out the door to be shot and then hoisted up on a dissection table. I don't even know what to say to that. I appreciate George leaving it, just the science. Oh, Jesus Christ, did I just say that? Just the leaving it clinical rather than overly descriptive. But Jesus Christ. Still, I'm really sorry I just said science there. That's so fucking crazy. This isn't science. This is just torture. Sorry. I don't know what... I don't even know. Neither man ever showed the faintest hint of remorse. Quite the opposite, in fact. They seemed to revel in it. Klauberg, for example, even bragged that once the process was perfected, he could sterilize hundreds of women a day. And in case you were wondering if there are any frontiers the Nazis weren't willing to violate, they also had to go at curing homosexuality. Because of course they did. It happened at Buchenwald in 1944 when an SS doctor named Karl Warnert decided he'd crack the problem. Again, his word, not mine, of same-sex attraction with a bit of surgical innovation. The solution? Implant a gland in the groin that slowly released testosterone over time. His theory was that if you flooded the body with enough male hormones, the attraction to other men would just go away. Not how it works, my dude. Needless to say, that didn't work. Sexuality, it will be a shock to absolutely none of you, isn't just a switch you can rewire with a needle and some hormones. It was also logic that depended on that frankly ridiculous yet still tragically ever so present today notion that there was something intrinsically feminine about homosexuality. Spoiler, there isn't. Turns out the only thing homosexuality dictates about your person is a preference for willies. Who could have known? What the implant did do, however, was cause horrific infections. At least one prisoner died from the procedure. Others were left with festering wounds, pain, and shame. None were cured, but all were traumatized. And yet, like so many others, Werner got away with it. After the war, he fled to Argentina with quiet help from sympathetic figures in Europe and lived out the rest of his life in comfort. No prison, no trial, no justice, just another Nazi doctor whose crimes were quietly brushed aside and left to rot in the footnotes of history. Throughout all of these atrocities, there was a common thread, and that would be the Nazi regime's perverse racial ideology. Many experiments were explicitly targeted at Jews, Roma, Slavs, or other groups the Nazis deemed inferior, with the goal, if one can even dignify it as a goal, often being to prove that inferiority or to find ways to eliminate or control those populations. There is one camp doctor, however, who blows all the barbarity we've seen thus far out of the water, and whose thirst for forsaken knowledge sets a new standard for man's inhumanity to man. And that would be Dr. Joseph Mengele. It's a name with which many of you are already familiar, and for tragically warranted reasons. His particular obsession was with twins, as well as a side interest in people with physical abnormalities, which could be anything from dwarfism to people with differently colored eyes. Why the particular obsession with twins, though? Well, simply put, he believed that twins held a deep genetic secret that could be used to multiply the Aryan race at lightning speed. Figure out how twins are made, figure out a way to induce the phenomenon at will, and then boom, all the workers and soldiers the glorious 1,000-year Reich could ever need. I mean, yeah, I do see the logic. It's fucking disturbed and insane. But yeah. Further still, however, Mengele also saw value in twins as the perfect natural experiment. Yeah, this is where I thought this was going. That's like the perfect control. Identical twins, of course. Identical genetics, raised in identical environments, and thus he reasoned any differences between them would have to be due to the influence of environmental factors. He arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, young, immaculately dressed, and armed with 2 doctorates, one in medicine, one in anthropology. Mengele was everything the SS loved to imagine itself as: intellectually brilliant, disciplined, and ideologically fanatical. He walked the arrival ramps with a jaunty, almost friendly air, smiling as he waved prisoners left or right, life or death, with barely a flick of the wrist. But if he spotted twins, his whole face lit up. They weren't sent to their immediate death or to labor away until their eventual death. No, their fate was all the more worse. And yeah, that was somehow possible. A bit of a side note here, folks, but I wanted to point out that here, in Mengele, we are seeing an encapsulation of everything that made the Nazis so terrifying as a force and idea. Oh, so often, we're prone to write them off as just a bunch of nutters. And sure, this makes for an easy process conclusion, as it answers the why question nice and easily. The reality, as we have seen, not just in Mengele but in many other examples today, is actually far, far worse, as many of them were actually strikingly intelligent and rational individuals, meaning that they proactively considered and mused over their actions, and then, in full clarity of mind, decided to do what they did. And that, to me, makes them far more terrifying than their simply being crazy. I hate it when people just say, oh, he's mad. Oh, they're crazy. Because it just writes it off as like some sort of, oh, that's the reason. Where it's not. Like, I don't know, I'll have conversations with people and they'll be like, oh, Putin's crazy. And I'm like, no, he's not. Writing him off as crazy diminishes what he's doing. He's not crazy. He's not mad. And that's worse. As for what makes otherwise irrational, intelligent people stray so far from the well-trodden moral path, that's a big matter. So I'll save it for its own episode sometime in the future. And to bring it back to the matter at hand now, when selected, the twins, often still just children, were immediately separated from their parents, as well as the general camp population more broadly, and were placed in special barracks. There, they were fed slightly better, actually given clean clothes, and even afforded luxuries, such as bathing. Such treatment was no mercy, however. All they were to Mengele was his prized and valuable stock which he wanted to be in the best possible condition for his purposes. From there, while beset by that eerie semblance of kindness, Mengele and his team could pore over all of them, spending untold hours measuring every part of them with calipers, photographing their faces and cataloguing every minute detail in eye shape, limb length, and posture. And then when that initial curiosity had been satisfied, the real horrors, his experiments, would begin. Sometimes it would be transfusing blood from one twin to the other, often repeatedly. Other times he would inject one of them with diseases, typhus, tuberculosis, whatever he had on hand in order to track infection and immune response. Oh, and on at least one occasion, for which evidencing documentation survive, he even forced sets of twins to have sex with each other in a grotesque attempt to see whether or not twins would themselves reliably produce twins. Bro, what the fuck? Also, what you doing? I mean, this doesn't make sense scientifically. I just always assumed he was working with identical twins, which obviously are not going to be able to recreate because they're of course the same gender. Non-identical twins are just siblings. What are you talking about? Oftentimes, Mengele's experiments would also be more surgical in nature, conducted without anesthetics because, well, of course they were. He would in some cases amputate limbs or remove organs from a twin while leaving the other twin with all the bits that God gave them as a macabre test group of sorts. When such an experiment resulted in the victim's death, which they did basically all the time, the surviving sibling would immediately be killed, usually via a quick injection of phenol as to not damage their remains in a way that a bullet would, and then both twins would be dissected side by side, the whole process being documented and catalogued before the remains, now little more than bio-waste in Mengele's eyes, were thrown on the pile of corpses to go through the incinerator. This is just fucking there's just no words, is there? Handily for this purpose, and something that I only figured out when I went to Auschwitz myself and made a point of tracking down his specific book, he even managed to score himself a spot right beside one of the camp's many crematoria. Knowing this fact alone should allow you to begin building a picture of just how many people he tortured and killed. Yeah, I've been to Auschwitz, and I don't know, maybe it makes this a little bit more real to me, or to, I don't know, but I was there. I mean, Jesus Christ. You know when you have memories and they lock in, right? And sometimes you'll see something or whatever and it locks in. The number of locked in memories I have from that visit is super disturbingly high. Not surprisingly, but it's in terms of permanent stored memories for 1 day's or half a day's trip to see that place is really high. I'm just thinking about them now and it's just stuff you don't want to think about. As for the matter of eye color, Mengele was reportedly fascinated, perhaps even irritated given Nazi ideology, by the fact that so many Roma children had blue eyes, which was of course the Nazi ideal. This natural injustice, as he saw it, got him thinking, was there a way to change eye color artificially? They saw him begin to inject chemical dyes directly into the iris of children to see if a desired change could be brought about, and it turns out, no it couldn't, and all this achieved were horrific infections, searing pain, and in many cases, permanent blindness. Interestingly, now you can have your eye color changed. It's a recently available cosmetic procedure. I think I saw it on YouTube Shorts. Not that the failure reduced the victims' value as test materials, however. Put it this way, when the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, they found jars full of preserved human eyeballs in Mengele's laboratory. On the point of the scale of his crimes, Dr. Miklos Naizli, a Jewish prisoner forced to work as his pathologist, recalled a night when Mengele personally murdered 14 twins, one after the other, just so he could complete a round of comparative autopsies. Another survivor, Moshe Arthur, remembered undergoing a series of painful surgeries and endless blood draws with his twin brother. When his brother died from infection, Moshe knew that he was next. Fortunately for him, however, this happened in January 1945, and so he was saved by the ever louder rumbling of Soviet artillery through the surrounding forest, as Mengele and his staff opted to spend the time they would have spent taking his life saving their own, fleeing the camp instead. And although I've alluded to it already, I want to say outright, to leave no doubt, the vast majority of his victims were children, many of them under the age of 10. Try to imagine that if you can. 6-year-olds subjected to daily blood draws, amputations, organ removals. I don't want to think about it, to be honest. My kids, I don't want to think about it. Among them were twin sisters Eva and Miriam Moses and the Ortwitz family of dwarves. They were among the most well-documented and willing to share survivors of Mengele's experiments, and so they provide a unique opportunity to really appreciate the horrors that these poor people were subjected to. Eva, for her part, later recalled being injected with an unknown substance that left her with a raging fever and near death. She was dumped in the infirmary, left to rot. Mengele, ever efficient, told Miriam, "Your sister will die in 2 weeks." An autopsy was then to follow, naturally a prospect that Mengele, who is described as practically salivating over. Mercifully, however, Eva didn't die. Through sheer force of will and perhaps a dash of luck, she pulled through. "I refused to die," she later said. And so she lived, in defiance of the man who had done everything in his power to change that fact. Unfortunately, most other victims weren't so fortunate. It's estimated that 1,500 sets of twins, 3,000 in all, passed through Mengele's hands, and that's to say nothing of those suffering from dwarfism and with other conditions that perked his devilish curiosity. When all was said and done, i.e. when the Red Army smashed through the wire, fewer than 200 of his victims were still alive. The rest had been dissected, infected, bled dry, or quietly murdered once they'd served their purpose. Concerning the fate of the monster himself, after fleeing Auschwitz, he headed deeper into what was left of the Reich and set up shop anew at Grossrosen concentration camp. Fortunately, his setting up a new house of horrors was interrupted again by the Red Army, and not even a month later they were battering down the gates there too. Seeing the writing on the wall, he did what every Nazi war criminal fearing Soviet retribution did. He headed westward to flee to the Americans, who were perceived as being the softer of all the touches available, and picked up a new identity as a humble Wehrmacht infantry officer along the way. They kill him, right? Wait, is Mengele the one who ended up in, no, who was the guy who the Israelis went and captured and brought back and then executed? It wasn't Mengele, was it? He's definitely killed, though. I think he gets killed at the Nuremberg trials. Or, executed afterwards. Oh, no! Oh, if only they'd tortured him to death. He would escape all justice, however. Oh, no! As after keeping his head down for a few years, he made it out to Brazil in 1949 and lived for another 30 years in near total peace. The only tribulation to befall him being his new neighbors themselves, also Nazis on the run, coming to think that he was a bit of a dick as the years wore on. That's really disappointing. And if the end to Mengele's story left you feeling a bit empty, as it certainly did me, worry not, because there is a smidge of ironic schadenfreude to be found. You see, after a really long and slightly bizarre series of events that I'll skip over because this chapter's already quite long, his skeleton ended up in the Sao Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, where it remains this very day and is used as a teaching aid. There's a certain irony in that, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. I'd just rather that he was killed. Number one, I'd rather he was captured by the Red Army. And number two, I'd rather he just go to Nuremberg and then they hang him. I don't like that this, one of the worst monsters of the Holocaust, just got to live another 30 years after torturing children. And with that, I can bring the explanation of Nazi experimentation to a close. It's been long, yes, but necessary, if you ask me. Because what we've just walked through wasn't a series of isolated atrocities, it was a methodical, state-sanctioned campaign of medical barbarism, carried out not in the shadows, but under the bright lights of laboratory lamps. These weren't fringe actors, well, save for one glaring exception anyway. They were professors, surgeons, military officers, and university-trained researchers operating with full knowledge and approval from the highest levels of the Nazi regime. And as I said at the beginning, however are we meant to start tackling the moral quandary of using the data from these experiments, if indeed anything useful was produced at all, if we don't understand their true barbarism? And now a history of Japan's experiments for the same reason. The Japanese experiments. In the frigid winds of Manchukuo, Imperial Japan's puppet state in Manchuria, northern China, whispers carried on the wind about a strange new lumber mill in Pingfang, then a small village on the outskirts of Harbin. In truth, however, no timber left its gates, as actually behind its walls the Imperial Japanese Army had quietly constructed a sprawling secret compound. By 1938, this installation, now a smidge under 6 square kilometers in size, resembled a small city of 76 buildings, spread among which were laboratories, barracks, even a library, bar, brothel, and Shinto shrine, all linked by private rail lines. Locals were warned away under the threat of gunfire and told the site was merely a sawmill, hence the aforementioned whispers. Most, however, never got so far as to even get a warning, as most had long since learned to simply stay out of their occupiers' way wherever possible to increase their odds of survival. For those of you not in the know, because the Pacific War does tend to fall through the cracks in the popular zeitgeist, there's no nice way to say it. The Japanese were complete and utter barbarians in their colonial endeavors. We're talking burning villages, mass executions, live burials, forced labor, sexual slavery, human trafficking, and decapitations for sport. Levels of barbary. Yeah, there's the rape of Nanking is arguably the most famous example of this, infamous example of this, and it is just fucking insane. It was the kind of imperial project where simply making eye contact with the wrong soldier could earn you a rifle butt to the face or worse. So when a military facility appeared out of nowhere, surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire, most civilians didn't ask questions. They just kept their heads down, their eyes averted, and prayed that whatever was going on inside had nothing to do with them. In reality, though, what lay within that lumber mill was the private kingdom of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brash army physician whose ambition had birthed a covert program to develop biological weapons. He had swept aside 10 villages to build his fortress of science, installing his own brother as prison warden to ensure absolute secrecy. As for what actually happened in there, Ishii and his hand-picked team unleashed and coordinated a campaign of human experimentation so grotesque that historian Daniel Barenblatt would later deem it a hidden genocide, one that claimed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Yeah, I mean, there's zero question that it was a genocide. Regarding who fell victim to it, in a nutshell, everyone who found themselves in Japanese territory who didn't happen to be Japanese themselves was at risk of finding themselves bludgeoned and whisked off there. Chinese peasants, Chinese resistance fighters, communist guerrillas, Soviet POWs, and Russian civilians, of which surprisingly large amount ended up in Manchuria after the Russian Civil War. The Kempeitai, Japan's secret police, really did not discriminate in that regard, although for obvious reasons of logistics, Chinese inmates of course made up the lion's share, by far. And once inside the compound, captives were stripped of their identity and referred to only by number, or more often the nickname Maruta, meaning logs. It was an in-joke among the staff, one that played on the cover story that had been spread locally. As one soldier posted later recounted, if you had asked about what went on above the second floor, you'd be told, that's the lumber storage, you don't go up there. But of course, the logs were people, and those upper floors weren't for storage. They were where the real work began. Inside those upper floors, behind sealed doors and sterile white tiles, the men in lab coats, many of them Ivy League caliber graduates of Japan's most prestigious medical schools, set about their work, and of course what followed wasn't research in any conventional sense. It was systemized torture masquerading as science. Over 3,000 men, women, and children passed through Unit 731's gates, and not a single one came out. Some were executed as soon as their usefulness ended. Others died screaming in examination chairs, carved apart in the name of data. A few were kept alive just long enough to be used again. Accordingly, the compound had its own crematorium, and that crematorium ran hot. The first step of many was infection. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to lethal pathogens, plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery, and then they were monitored like human petri dishes. Once symptoms appeared, they were dragged into the operating theater and vivisected alive. No anesthetic, no pretense of treatment. Quote, as soon as the symptoms were observed, the prisoner was taken into the dissection room. That's Hal Gold relaying eyewitness accounts. The quote continues, he was stripped and placed on the table, screaming, trying to fight back. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth, and then with one quick slice of the scalpel, he was opened up. Even with their abdomen split open, victims often remained alive, alert, aware, and in agony. As Gold also noted, a human being can survive quite a long time under such conditions, just as in surgery, except here there was no intention to save them. This is just... I know about this, and it's still just how far people can go. Just how we can be just such pieces of shit. Witnesses described the screams, unearthly at first, then suddenly silent as shock took over. Surgeons rummaged through still writhing bodies, extracting whatever samples they wanted, and then dumped the remains in shallow pits or fed them into the crematorium. Some victims bled out. Others were finished off by a bullet or a syringe. What mattered was the data. What didn't was the body. Elsewhere in the facility, other teams took up the question of human endurance. One of the most notorious trials, in an eerie parallel of the Nazi experiments we looked at earlier, focused on cold exposure. The man in charge of that one was a physiologist by the name of Hisato Yoshimura, and what he lacked in conscience he made up for in curiosity. He wanted to find out how frostbite set in, how it progressed, and what, if anything, could bring a victim back from the brink. And of course his methods were as crude as they were cruel. Test subjects marched outside into the bitter Manchurian winter, stripped to the waist or even entirely naked, and forced to plunge their arms into barrels of near-freezing water. The goal was to observe the exact moment when the limb froze solid, and to check if the flesh had hardened. Guards would beat the arm with a stick. If it made a dull wooden knock, they knew it was ready. And that's not a metaphor. It was literally the sound they listened for, like tapping a plank of wood. Once properly frozen, the rewarming trials began. Yoshimura and his assistants, again just like his Nazi counterparts, tried different methods: immersion in warm water, dry heat, rubbing with cloth, or simply leaving the victim out and seeing what nature did. Victims moaned in pain as sensation returned. Or didn't. Blackened skin peeled away, gangrene set in, some limbs ballooned and split open, others simply died and rotted. One prisoner reportedly had both arms frozen and thawed so many times that the flesh tore off in strips. At the end of the test, they were taken away to be dissected. None were treated, none were saved. The only question was, what did the chart say? There were also X-ray trials. Victims were strapped to tables and blasted with radiation. The early sessions were mild, enough to cause burns and nausea. Later, they escalated the dosage. Skin sloughed off. Internal organs failed. Some subjects were cooked from the inside out. The survivors, the ever so few that there were then eventually killed and autopsied to assess organ damage. And just for good measure, Unit 731 also ran centrifuge tests. Victims were strapped into giant spinning machines and subjected to increasing G-forces until their blood vessels burst or their hearts gave out. At the end, technicians hosed the remains off the walls and moved on to the next set. Water deprivation. What are you studying here? This is just fucking torture. Water deprivation was another area of interest. How long could a person survive with nothing to drink? What about drinking salt water or eating poisoned rice? Victims were locked in bare concrete rooms and denied water for days. They went quiet after the third or fourth day. Some clawed at the walls, others licked condensation off the steel bars or drank their own urine. Eventually, they collapsed. Their final moments were recorded: pulse, respiration, organ failure, before they were dissected for the data. Electricity? Yeah, they tried that too. Hanging people upside down for hours? Standard procedure. Crushing with weight, stabbing, drowning, resuscitating, and starving. Also, any and all torture was fair game, as long as it could be masqueraded as science. Fucking animals. But the frostbite tanks and decompression chambers were still, in a strange way, clinical. Scientific, at least in theory, even if their actual reality was anything but. What came next was something else entirely, because perhaps the most depraved chamber in Unit 731's catalogue of horrors was the one where rape, pregnancy, and sexually transmitted disease became tools of research. I'm sorry, but how is rape gonna be masqueraded as science? How's that even remotely possible? Ostensibly, it came about because the Japanese army was worried about syphilis. It was rampant among their troops, in no small part due to the near constant sexual crimes that they took part in. Again, rape of Nanking for a fucking horrific example of that at scale. And with syphilis at its very worst, having symptoms such as cankers, painless open sores often on the genitals or mouth in its initial stages, and condylomata lata, large raised lesions in warm, moist areas of the body in its second stages, all symptoms that can totally put a soldier out of action, finding an effective solution was a serious strategic concern. How about this for an effective strategic solution, Japanese military? Stop fucking raping people. Have you tried that? And to undertake said research, they needed to get people infected with syphilis, didn't they? And I think you can all guess where this is going. They took the direct approach to causing infections. Oh, how very scientific, guys. Well done. So it was that male prisoners known to be infected were ordered to rape uninfected female prisoners. Refusal was a death sentence. Women were told nothing or lied to or simply thrown into the cell and locked in. Then it was repeated until symptoms appeared. And just in case that wasn't horrible enough, pregnant women were also not excluded. They were proactively included, as in some experiments, Ishii wanted to see if syphilis could pass through the placenta. Oh, and on a particularly misery-inspiring extra note, Unit 731 scientists also weren't averse to raping prisoners themselves, and yes, that did mean they would end up conducting foul experiments upon their own children. What the fuck is happening? That is a bit of knowledge that I did not know going into this. Those who made it to the end of pregnancy were taken into surgery. Vivisection again, this time to retrieve the fetus while still inside the womb. Some of these newborns were infected, some were malformed, all were killed. I was about to say at this point that no baby ever left Unit 731 alive, but it'd be a moot point because I've already said that no prisoner left alive, not a single one. It's also worth saying that if you can believe such a thing was even possible, women generally had it far worse than men in the unit. Chiefly, this was because they were considered multi-use. A man would be dragged from his cell, experimented upon, and then vivisected, but women, they could be used in an infection trial, a pregnancy experiment, all before they went to the scalpel, in between which would be constant sexual attacks by the staff. On that point, one guard admitted under questioning that during a break in his schedule, he and a colleague once unlocked a cell containing a Chinese woman and raped her. Later, they opened another cell, and inside was a woman who had already been used in a frostbite test. Her fingers were missing, her hands were black. He was about to rape her too, but stopped when he noticed that her genital area was, in his words here, festering. He walked away, and she was sent to vivisection table the next day. Then there was the weapons testing. At the proving grounds near the rear of Unit 731 compound, prisoners were tied to wooden posts at varying distances from bombs, grenades, or chemical canisters. Explosives were detonated and injuries observed. Researchers walked among the dying with notebooks measuring shrapnel wounds and trauma radius. Some prisoners were shot in the thigh to test bullet trauma. Others were stabbed repeatedly with bayonets to simulate battlefield injuries. There are accounts of prisoners being burned alive with flamethrowers, of skin being peeled back to study. This is just too much. This is just too much. And I know I maybe should have stopped with the Auschwitz Mengele experiments, because I feel like if I'm skipping bits here, then it diminishes the horror of the previous ones, but I think it's more just because this is second, and I've already gone through the horror of the first one, and I mean, guys, you know what it is. You know what it is. Just gonna skip ahead to something less, like equally horrific, but just less gory. There's another unit, 100, that's based in Changchun. Its official cover story was agricultural research, veterinary medicine, animal husbandry, epidemic prevention. In practice, it focused on diseases of livestock and how to deploy them against enemy economies. How do you cripple a region, kill its horses, kill its cattle, poison its fields? That was the general logic. And so Unit 100 bred diseases like glanders and anthrax by the kilogram. And yes, human test subjects were involved once again. Prisoners were exposed to the animal pathogens to see how they might spread between species and how virulent they became once mutated. At least one former lab assistant, Senior Sergeant Kazuo Mitomi, later admitted to poisoning prisoners with everything from heroin to castor beans to cyanide. He described one Russian prisoner who became so exhausted from repeated drug trials that their final experiment was cancelled. A vivisection was carried out, and then, having survived the procedure, he was given a final injection of potassium cyanide recorded in a notebook and then thrown into a pile of bodies to be fed to the furnace. Then there was Unit 1644 that operated out of Nanjing. It was bigger than Unit 100, having over 1,000 staff as compared to a few hundred, and it handled mass production of bacterial agents, fleas infected with plague, rats loaded with typhus, flies smeared with cholera, that kind of thing. The prisoners here, kept naked and in tiny cages so that all symptoms could be fully observed, were infected by proximity to the infected animals and by direct injection, any and all ways per the demands of any given experiment. Then, of course, when they'd outlived their usefulness, vivisection. A doctor named Hiroshi Matsumoto later described the process in detail, recalling one particular infected subject who was chloroformed, sliced open at the groin, and then their femoral artery severed. Blood was drained into flasks to infect more fleas, or poison water, or just dumped. The corpses went into the incinerator, and they were replaced. And Matsumoto had not even a single ounce of emotion during the process. By 1940, they had enough bacterial and delivery systems to go operational, and so Unit 1644 began supplying frontline units in addition to continuing its research. The first attack using its pathogens occurred in autumn of the same year, when Japanese bombers flew over the city of Ningbo and dropped bundles of rice, wheat, and cloth crawling with plague-infected fleas. The locals gathered them, unaware, and within days the outbreak began. High fevers, swollen lymph nodes, death. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off and burned to the ground in a desperate attempt to stop the spread. It didn't work, and thousands, the majority of Ningbo's population in fact, had died by the time the outbreak waned. This was also Japan's first confirmed use of biological weapons in combat, or as much as you can ever call deployment against unresistant civilians combat anyway. And tragically, it wasn't going to be the last. Now, before we get into the deployments, I hope you forgive a slight but pertinent tangent. If you made it this far into the episode, you're clearly into World War II history, so no harm as far as I'm concerned. You see, the way I understand it, World War II history, or more rather the common understanding thereof, is plagued by what I've come to term as boomerisms, which is to say incorrect facts that refuse to die because they were heavily pushed by and are rooted in the overly rose-tinted and romanticism that war movies of the 1950s through 70s created, which the boomer generation grew up on. I bring this up because they never used chemical or biological weapons in World War II, is one of the common ones that you come across. And as you have seen, when it comes to biological weapons, that simply is not correct. Isn't that, I feel like it was more in the Pacific theater, which is perhaps why this boomerism sticks around, but I'm not sure. And nor is it correct for chemical weapons either, as the Japanese first used mustard gas in the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 and would continue to do so right through to the end of the war. The eagle-eared amongst you will have also noticed that I referred to the 1937 Battle of Shanghai as being part of World War II, a conflict that is typically given a starting date of the 1st of September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. As you've likely ascertained, I happen to think that start date is a lot of bollocks, and if you were to ask me, World War II began on July the 7th, 1937, when Japan commenced its full-scale invasion of China. Yeah, I believe if you ask someone in China, it's kind of relative to your cultural background, right? Because the Nazis' invasion of Poland, I think, in the West is probably the generally taught thing, but I imagine, I don't know for sure, but in China that it's taught rather differently. There were lots of theatres of World War II. It was a world war after all. If you're wondering why this isn't the accepted wisdom anyway, the common narrative stands like this. World War II began on the 1st of September and on the 7th of December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the US into the war. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which had been raging for over 4 years already between an Axis power and an eventual Allied one, had already resulted in over 10 million deaths. Then, just magically, it became the Chinese front of the conflict. Perfect logic, right? And if you ask me, this understanding of the conflict's start is also one of the aforementioned boomerisms, and possibly one of the more malevolent ones too, as I believe it to be the product of a very intentional effort by post-war historians to keep the conflict Eurocentric for their own heroic nationalistic narratives and reduce China, and indeed Japan in many ways, to mere secondary actors in someone else's story. Yeah, I think, again, it's a cultural background, right? I growing up was oh yeah, Second World War, Britain versus the Nazis. And that is just so oddly culturally centric. If you asked a Russian, they'd be like, oh no, Britain, you were a side player. It was us versus the Nazis. Look at the fucking death toll. And people in Asia would be like, well, this was, where the real shit was happening. It's all culturally relative. I can name names too. Consider Hugh Trevor Roper in his book The Last Days of Hitler. To him, World War II was very much only about Europe and Nazism, and everything else was secondary. And Andreas Hillgruber in his book Germany and the Two World Wars. You know, everything you need to know from the title here. Both World War I and World War II are presented as German and, by extension, Europe-centric stories. These are just two of hundreds as well. It was the narrative of the time, challenged only by the likes of A.J.P. Taylor in his book The Origins of the Second World War, and he was a big socialist, so this often led him to taking a little people first approach to his histories, which led him to some interesting and unconventional conclusions. But even he didn't argue that it started in 1937 explicitly, only that a conflict cannot be understood without knowing its build-up, and so a start date at all is pointless in military history. Yeah, I agree. I think, when you think about the Third World War or whatever, and people are like, oh, did that already start with all of the conflicts that are going on in the world today? I think the general consensus is no. But there's not really a point where you're like, oh yeah, this is when a world war began. Because a world war involves the world. There's lots of conflicts and battles.
Germany decided to go to war. And who did they go to war with? The world. It had never been tried before.
Fortunately today, academic history is way more open to the idea of World War II starting in 1937, with an example being Rainer Mitte, who pushed the idea heavily in his 2013 book Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, 1937 to 1945. Chinese historians, too, unsurprisingly, have been at the tip of the spear, a great example of which would be Chen Jian, who published The Road to a Global War, a Chinese study of the origins of the Second World War, all the way back in 1989. Ultimately, however, Wikipedia won't be updating its start date until the idea trickles down to the boomer popular historians and their acolytes who've been pumping out coffee table histories for the last 60 years or so. I'm not going to be naming any of them because I love money and I low-key need to ride on their coattails to get my own works published in a profitable manner. That's not a bit too. I've got 2 manuscripts ready to send to printers, but offers for publishing at this point haven't sparked joy in the old wallet department. And to close off this rather long tangent, here's some other World War II boomerisms that I want to see dead and buried in my lifetime. The average German soldier was a square-jawed giga-chad who fought with the honor of the knights of old, and it was only those scabs with the runes on their collars who did the naughty shit. No, they weren't. Everyone in Germany knew the explicitly murdery details come 1941, so stop feeding into Nazi revisionism. Yep. Well said, George. On a similar vein, Rommel was an honorable general who treated his enemy with respect even during their defeat. No, he wasn't. He wanted to start murdering French settlements in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia style to quell the French resistance. He was every bit the monster that the rest of them were. Nazi Germany had the most advanced technology. No, they didn't. The Me-262 jet fighter had engines that blew themselves up after 10 hours of operation. The Panther tank needed a new gearbox pretty much as often as it needed a new tank of fuel. They used horses for lugging stuff far more than they used trucks. Instead, the prize, in my opinion, goes to the Americans. See the B-29, the M1 Garand, the proximity fuse, and the Norden bomb sight for more details. Yep.
She's a beauty, ain't you? Yeah.
George, yes, preaching to the choir on this one, mate. Nazi Germany could have won the war. No, they couldn't, and I can explain in 3 words. Oil, 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 or rather a lack of oil. No matter the set circumstances one cooks up what Germany could have done differently, they all fall short when you consider that they barely had enough black gold to put up the defense they actually did, never mind anything more harebrained. And with that, Tangent Over, you're welcome for that little morale break where we didn't have to think about human experiment for a brief time. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. That was it. Other examples of when Japan deployed biological weapons made at Unit 1644. In 1941, for example, the city of Changde was bombarded with plague, this time via contaminated clothing, cotton, and fleas. Around 7,000 civilians died. Then came the time that they used it, which was during the May to September Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. More broadly, this saw the Japanese military lay waste to a 50,000 square kilometer area of coastline, killing and burning everything they could get their hands on to make the area near uninhabitable and thus unusable as a staging post for potential raids against the Japanese home islands. 250,000 people died in that campaign. And then they released cholera, typhoid, plague-infected fleas as they retreated, killing many thousands more still. The fall of 1942 did not mark the end of Japan's ghastly germ offensive, however, far from it, in fact. Even in the Zhejiang-Jiangxi operation, The Imperial Army kept right on spreading death by disease wherever it could. That same year, for example, special attack units struck Yunnan province with cholera bacteria, seeding an epidemic in dozens of towns. Within a few months, some 120,000 Chinese civilians fell violently ill and 90,000 of them died as a result. Then, 2 years later, as Japan's fortunes waned, they turned bubonic plague loose in western Yunnan on their way out. Outbreaks of the Black Death flared up again and kept killing people for years after the war. Plague festered in the region until 1953, long after its invaders had been vanquished. In other words, the pathogens didn't politely clock out in 1945 just because Japan did. I didn't know that. I kind of think of the big remnant of war as unexploded munitions and mines. But wow, these things, but anthrax as well, can stick around for a really long time. The germs Japan seeded kept on gnawing their way through villages and families in peacetime, a lethal legacy of the occupiers' experiments. Japan's biological onslaught may have even spread outside of China too. In 1942, for example, as the Japanese army marched into Burma, their agents considered using cholera against British and Chinese troops there. And a mysterious cholera outbreak did strike one Allied unit, hinting that the idea might have been more than just talk, although I cannot stress enough that explicit evidence of the use of biological weapons has not emerged for this incident. It's very much speculation based upon circumstance and not correlation. We do know, however, that they were within a whisker of deploying them on American and Filipino troops as they made their desperate last stand in Bataan in the Philippines. Flea-riddled bombs were ready to go, and it was only the garrison's sudden surrender in April 1942 that spared them from that fate. And still, despite all that, the Japanese army was still only just warming up, because as the war went on, and their fortunes quickly went from incredible to downright disastrous, Ishii began cooking up ever more elaborate and wild schemes for bioweapon deployment, for example, biologically scorching the earth behind retreating enemy lines. If the army had to give up ground, why not leave captured cities reeling with cholera and filled with plague corpses as parting gifts? Testimonies by former unit members later suggested that in at least a few cases, these scorched germ tactics were attempted. Countless supplies or infected prisoners were left behind to ensure conquering forces, be they Chinese, Imperial, British, or American, inherited an epidemic or two for their trouble. In short, by 1945, the Japanese military was ready to turn all of East Asia into its petri dish if it could not hold on to it by force. Jesus is fucking childish. If you can't have it, no one can. Although, to be fair, saying all of East Asia isn't strictly correct, because they also cooked up a plan to deploy them on the continental United States. The plan, euphemistically named Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, involved using submarine-launched aircraft to drop plague-infected fleas over Southern California. I vaguely remember learning about this. It took a fair bit of nagging to get the green light, if for no other reason than the fact that Japanese high command had far bigger concerns come then than getting a few token jabs in on US's home turf. But by mid-1945, with mere months of the war remaining, said green light was given. So it was that a few I-400 submarines, the largest ones ever built during the war in fact, and each capable of carrying 3 foldable bombers in watertight internal hangars, were destined to set off across the Pacific, surface off the US West Coast, and dump their infected bombs on San Diego before then crashing into something important at max throttle. Oh wow, just suicide missions, huh? It was a grotesque plan, mass terrorism via medieval disease, but thankfully it never came to fruition. The launch date was set for September the 22nd, you see, and Japan surrendered on the 15th of August. And if you happen to think that I've gone a bit off track here talking about the deployment of biological weapons as opposed to just their development and testing, don't worry, I haven't, because I have to say, George, I was completely lost in your telling, which is a good sign. Because to those scientists, such deployments were experiments in themselves, with Unit 1644 scientists always being in the proximity to make notes and collect data on how it played out, both to improve dispersion strategies, but also spitball ideas for how the contagions themselves could be tinkered and fettled with to increase their lethality. And speaking of Unit 1644 again, before we ended up going on that pertinent, if lengthy, spur in the road, I was just introducing the other units and their specialities, wasn't I? First, we have Unit 1855, based out of Beijing, a city which, thanks to its size and status, seemed the perfect spot to host a regional arm of Japan's rapidly metastasizing medical death machine. It was officially formed in 1938, and while surviving documentation from this one is sparse, thanks largely to the destruction of evidence at the war's end and the passing of time, enough has survived through witness testimony, captured logs, and post-war interrogations to give us a grim picture of what went on behind those walls. The unit's primary focus was on typhoid, tuberculosis, dysentery, and cholera, but they also dabbled in anthrax and glanders, especially when experimenting on animals and testing cross-species, i.e. animal to human infection. Its victims found themselves locked in isolation cells, infected by ingestion, injection, or inhalation, and then monitored until the symptoms became visible enough to justify vivisection. Dissection theaters were used daily, with victims strapped down, still often conscious as their organs were removed and catalogued. No anesthetic, no mercy, just data. There were even reports brought forward in the 1950s by Chinese investigators of the unit conducting field experiments, such as infected blankets being distributed to rural villages suspected of harboring communist partisans, or cholera-laced food supplies being accidentally delivered to resistance-linked communities. One Japanese medic, whose testimony was later used in a classified report, admitted that powdered cholera cultures were loaded into trucks and sent off with the vague instruction to seed the wells. Jesus Christ. Whether the target village had any strategic value seemed to be entirely secondary to the urge to test, gather field data, and simply just satisfy a wicked curiosity. In essence, Unit 1855 was a regional clone of Unit 731. Same mission, same methods, just set up shop in the north instead of the northeast. And if you thought that was as bleak as things got, allow me to introduce you to their southern counterpart, Unit 8604, which operated out of the occupied city of Guangzhou. Now, Unit 8604 was particularly egregious, not just for what it did, but for where it did it. You see, the Japanese set up in the old Sun Yat-sen Medical School an actual civilian teaching hospital, which they then converted into one of the most perverse labs in the entire Imperial war machine. From 1939 to 45, this building, once a place where Chinese doctors learned to save lives, was turned into a slaughterhouse, posing as a research facility. The unit was broken up into multiple internal sections, with the fourth section, for example, being responsible for plague cultivation, and the second and third, for their part, handling anthrax, cholera, typhus, and related pathogens. Victims were held in basement cells infected with cultured diseases and then examined until they died or until they were deemed ripe enough, the doctor's words, not mine, for vivisection. Corpses lined the walls, pickled in formalin. Some were dissected post-mortem, others while still alive. One anatomical director reportedly carried out multiple vivisections every day, a routine so regular it became bureaucratic. If that is becoming bureaucratic to you, I got news, you're a fucking psychopath. The data was logged, the bodies incinerated. One former Chinese prisoner later testified that female captives were routinely raped by guards before being subjected to syphilis infection trials, a grim echo of what we already saw in Pinfang. Infected prisoners were also sometimes forced into sexual contact under the guise of clinical procedure, and pregnant women were of particular interest, not because they were spared, of course, but because they could be used to test transplacental infection and congenital deformities in utero. Fetuses who were surgically removed, catalogued, and either used for further lab work or discarded. In several of the more horrific cases, there's credible evidence to suggest that newborns were dissected alive, all to see what internal damage syphilis or anthrax had done. You're vivisecting babies. No words. And just like its cousins further north, Unit 8604 maintained its own crematorium, its own prisoner registry, and its own dedicated disposal system. According to historian Daniel Barenblatt, Unit 8604 alone was likely responsible for over 1,000 deaths, and that's just what we can reasonably account for given the surviving documentation. The real number, given the presence of unrecorded victims, destroyed logs, and undocumented field deployments, was almost certainly higher. Nor is it strictly confined to Guangzhou, as sub-branches operated in Zhangjiang, Shantou, and even in occupied Hong Kong, where reports suggest that cholera-tainted food was distributed in working-class neighborhoods as part of a covert test. It was all very clean on paper, and utterly filthy in practice. The doctors wore white coats, the labs were well lit, the data was logged neatly, and yet, behind the procedural gloss, it was just mass murder, disguised as microbiology, same as always. I say it's just torture as well. Torture mass murder. You vivisecting people alive? Yeah. These two facilities, 1855 and 8604, they weren't just footnotes. They were not ancillary. They were key components of Ishii's grand design. With 731 at the center, 100 handling agricultural pathogens, 1644 handling mass production, and these two running frontline tests in their respective regions, the Japanese Empire had created an entire ecosystem of horror, and all of it, every needle jab, every bacterial smear, every incision into a living chest cavity, was done not to save lives, but to perfect the art of taking them. Science turned sadistic. Medicine turned monstrous. By mid-1945, however, with the Soviet Red Army crashing through Manchuria from the north and the Americans thundering toward the home islands from the south, Japan's grand experiment in weaponized disease finally began to unravel. The writing was on the wall, and the masterminds behind Unit 731 and its sister units knew exactly what came next. The order went out, swift, brutal, absolute. Destroy everything. Years of meticulously logged human experimentation gone, bacterial cultures by the gallon, racks of dissected tissue samples, rooms of handwritten autopsy reports, all fed to bonfires or dumped in acid vats. Laboratories were stripped bare, storage tanks ruptured, petri dishes shattered. At Pingfang, for example, the Japanese army took the demolition orders literally and blew the place to bits. Not just the labs, but the barracks, operating theaters, the rail yards, even the crematorium. It was all reduced to rubble in the space of days. But the most chilling cleanup of all was reserved for the human evidence. Hundreds of remaining prisoners and final logs, as Ishii and his men so dehumanizingly called them, were executed en masse. Some were poisoned, others bayoneted, a few were shot in the back of the head while still strapped to surgical slabs. Their corpses were burned, buried in unmarked pits, or simply left in the wreckage. The goal was clear: leave nothing behind, no test subjects, no files, no proof. And just in case that wasn't enough, Ishii's men went one step further, releasing cages of infected rats and fleas into the surrounding countryside in what can only be described as a biological parting gift. The aim? Distract advancing Soviet forces with plague outbreaks, and maybe, just maybe, buy themselves enough time to fully erase all the evidence. Before fleeing himself, Ishii gathered his staff and gave them one final directive: disappear, take the secrets to the grave. To help them along, he issued each man a cyanide capsule and a pistol with strict instructions to use one or the other if they ever got caught. To him, suicide was preferable to justice, and yet despite that intense effort, so rushed had it been, that many stones actually remained unturned and lots of evidence and indeed data would survive the war. And that brings us to the natural follow-up question, indeed the real meat of today's episode. 2 hours in, all right. For all that horror and effort, was anything actually learned in the process, and if so, what? Yeah, and then I guess, as George has mentioned a few times, the idea of tackling the ethical question of whether it's ethical to use this data. So what was actually learned? In the starting chapter, I need to admit that I found myself rather surprised. You see, thanks to World War II, as well as the crimes of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, as inseparable aspects thereof being quite the large topic, I hadn't actually had the chance to dive into the matter of human experimentation in depth before I suggested this topic to Simon. I've covered in passing, as passing details in wider stories of atrocities, sure, but powering through dedicated texts and going into depth in its own right, well, no. As a result, I went into this piece with a certain preconception, that being that every single human experiment was a scientific nonsense, and that as a result, the difficult moral matter of having any value at all from it can be completely disregarded, and we could turn our attention to the real matter at hand, the memory and commemoration of those who had to suffer through all of those utterly barbaric and barely conceivable horrors that I've spent the episode up until now explaining to you. But then I started strip mining pertinent academic articles on JSTOR, as well as all the PDF-backed books that I could get my hands on. And that's when I came across The Nazi Research Data, Should We Use It?, published by Sarah Wilson of Cedarville University all the way back in 2011. In it, she says the following, or quote her, "Many have questioned the scientific data, and reasonable questions remain. However, at least some of the data is valid and even useful to scientific inquiry today. Certainly, not all of the Nazi data is accurate, but enough is accurate to justify wrestling with the ethical concerns over using it," end quote. So you see the problem there. Some of the data is valid. 6 little words that just made today's episode a whole lot more complicated, and if I might be quite frank, also low-key made me worry that I might catastrophically misread the literature and accidentally produce some ignorant as fuck ramblings more befitting one of those mad Nazi apologist and neo-Nazi channels, such as Never heard of Zoomer Historian. Probably sounds like that's for the better. Although I'm sure there'll be if they're notable enough for George to mention it, there'll probably be some apologists or defenders in the comments. Rather than the high standard of research and quality I know me and my fellow writers always try to provide you with. And Simon, please feel free to tell the editor to stick a censored bleep over the channel's name if we're not in the mood for any drama. Although, if we are, that does give me an idea for a brain blaze. I just don't know enough about it. So, leave it in, I guess? I say that I'll look it up afterwards, but it sounds like I'm probably best not. Not really a fan of neo-Nazi shit. So then, with that said, off we go, people, once more into the breach, where I hopefully will not make a giant tit of myself. And let's begin with the experiments of Dr. Sigmund Rascher. You remember, the one who was discredited as a man of medicine by even the Nazis themselves. So why him of all people in this chapter, where it turns out, despite the barbarism of his methods and very, very questionable methodology often displayed, he did actually end up compiling some useful stuff. For example, he learned that rapid immersion in hot water between 40 and 50 Celsius is the most effective way to rewarm someone suffering from hypothermia. Rascher and his team tried every method going, if you recall. Rubbing, blankets, heated cradles, even diathermy. But only hot baths worked. As Dr. Robert Pozos explains in Military Medical Ethics, Volume 2, quote, hot baths between 40 and 50 Celsius were the most effective in rewarming the hypothermic subjects and reversing the afterdrop. And conversely, quoting again, wrapping a person in blankets gave the least effective results. Unless you were only mildly hypothermic to begin with, that is. And speaking of afterdrop, we can thank Rascher's ice bath torture sessions for discovering the full ins and outs of how it actually works. And if you happen to be wondering, afterdrop refers to the phenomena where the body temperature of someone suffering from hypothermia continues to plummet for a time following removal from cold conditions. Pozos also explains the immediate revelations of this discovery by stating that the Luftwaffe used it to explain, quote, why pilots and sailors who were removed from the cold water and subsequently were rewarmed sometimes died 30 minutes or later after rescue. I didn't even know that was a thing. Rascher's team also figured out that hypothermia actually kills by shutting down vital organs one by one, the heart most of all. Well done, guys. Really, hypothermia shuts down your organs, does it? As people's core body temperature dropped, to explain further, Rascher and his team noted that their heartbeats became unstable around 30 to 29 degrees Celsius, and once it fell to about 25, that was usually the point of no return, and the heart stopped shortly afterwards. The whole process, incidentally, from being put in freezing water to death, was documented as taking between 53 and 106 minutes during the human experiments. Additionally, Rascher and his team managed to disprove a bunch of wartime survival myths, such as the long-held belief that drinking alcohol would help you warm up. Pozos makes it clear, quote, the ingestion of ethanol before immersion did not change the rate of body cooling. In fact, it may have made things worse by contributing to cardiac irregularities induced by the hypothermia. So yes, whenever you're in the pub and someone points out the beer blanket is a myth, they're ultimately citing an understanding with its roots in Nazi human experimentation. So yes, as much as it makes me really uncomfortable to say so, some of that absolute demon's research was useful. Pozos says as much when discussing the legacy of Rascher's data in later medical scholarship, quoting him, the hypothermia experiments had bearing in two areas of research. 1, hypothermia effects on the entire body, and 2, hypothermia feasibility in open heart surgery. From a brief review of the use of Nazi data after World War II, it is apparent that the data were of value to understanding the mechanics of hypothermia, as well as to the use of hypothermia to an adjunct to open heart surgery, end quote. I mean, yeah, this is all well and good. And it's like, okay, great, so the data was useful. Ends does not justify the means, guys. You were torturing people to death to figure out that drinking alcohol doesn't keep you warm. Yeah, right? But, and this is a giant neon-illuminated, visible from orbit, but none of this does anything to change the fact that Rascher was ultimately a crank, and all of those contemporary criticisms of him remain absolutely true. Instead, it's more of a fling enough shit and eventually something will stick and a broken clock is right twice a day sort of situation. I.e., he documented his wicked torture in detail sufficient for trends to invariably emerge from the vast body of data accumulated. Dr. Robert Berger of Harvard University explains this more eloquently in his work, Nazi Science, the Dachau Hypothermia Experiments, which he wrote for the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1990, and we'll quote him here. The experimental design was poor, the data was shoddy, and the investigator, Rascher, was a murderer, so most of his work could not be trusted. Keyword there. Most, like I say, broken clock and all that. Interestingly, the same conclusion was reached by Dr. Andrew Ivy, an American physician who testified at the doctor's trial and was described in a contemporary Time magazine piece as, quote, one of the nation's top physiologists and the conscience of US science. Initially, when giving his testimony at said trials, he said that, and we'll quote him here, some of the men who worked in these laboratories were well-trained scientists and others were untrained pseudoscientists. None were motivated by the spirit of the true scientist, namely to seek truth for the good of humanity. The German scientists had become immoral and dishonest, therefore their achievements were of a pseudoscientific character. The greatest of all medical tragedies was further magnified by the fact that the experiments performed added nothing of significance to medical knowledge, end quote. Now, given time to think on the matter, he'd later change his tone as demonstrated by the following, which he wrote in a 1954 letter. Some of the tests had very worthwhile results, and I hope to collect all the worthwhile results and have them published. But again, notice the phrasing here, all the worthwhile results, not the results. His claim was not that Rasch's experiments were scientifically sound, merely that some worthwhile data could be found among the enormous quantity that was produced. Again, fling enough and some is going to stick. And while we're on the topic of Rascher, let's pivot neatly into his high-altitude experiments. As for what was learned from them, scientifically speaking, not a whole lot that wasn't already broadly suspected. But what they did do was prove those suspicions, with a specific example being that without supplemental oxygen, most people lose consciousness somewhere between 18 and 25,000 feet, and death follows quickly after that. Again, it's a revelation born from how extensively they documented their wider cruelty, recording things like pulse rates, breathing changes, and exactly how long it took for a person to black out. But still, the fact remains, this is data which is used in the real world every day, today. Take civil aviation. If you're flying away on your holidays and the cabin suddenly depressurizes for whatever reason, standard procedure is to immediately dive to a breathable atmosphere while those dangly little respirators provide you with enough chemical oxygen to remain conscious through the descent. And where do you think the hard data to know beyond all doubt what a breathable altitude was? Well, yes, Nazi experiments. Of course, data was beforehand and has since been gathered from elsewhere, animal studies, flight incident reports, and the like, but proper real testing of the matter on human beings, at least to such extremes, was only ever done in World War II human experimentation. Right, and they just went insanely far with it, though. Like, you can figure this out ethically. You can start by doing it on animals, then you can do it on people. Like, if someone was like, Simon, we're going to pay you a lot of money, you got to get into that chamber, and we're going to just take you up to an altitude, and you tell me when you think you're going to black out, and we'll give you these cognitive tests so that we can see how competent you are at different altitudes. And I'll be like, how much money? I've done medical testing for money. I've tested random drugs, and then, taken away a fat paycheck. And if you're thinking, but surely nobody would actually use that data, well, I'm afraid they did. As an example, after the war, copies of Rascher's findings quietly filtered into Allied hands, and according to historians like Alexander Michelich and Doctors of Infamy, US aviation medicine researchers absolutely reviewed the Dachau altitude data, albeit behind closed doors. It didn't appear in public journals, he was keen to stress, but it did show up in internal memos and classified reports, especially during the early Cold War, when the Air Force was scrambling to understand rapid decompression risks at extreme altitudes. So yes, Rascher's numbers, pulled from the dying breaths of Dachau prisoners, helped shape post-war aviation safety protocols. They became part of the foundation for pressurization standards, oxygen system designs, and emergency descent procedures. You won't find him credited in any textbook, but the data's fingerprints are still there. I don't know how to feel about this. Because it's like, okay, we have the data, should we just ignore it? And then all of these people have died in vain? But then also, you're going to be like, well, they were tortured to death in order to get this data. Is that data we should really be using? I don't know how to feel about this. I don't think it's an ethical thing that an ethical quandary that I'm going to solve right now. I don't think it's solvable necessarily. Another case where Nazi data slipped into post-war use was chemical weapons, specifically the Reich's research into phosgene gas toxicity. To explain, decades later, in the 1980s, those very results resurfaced with John Vandenberg, a senior official at the US Environmental Protection Agency, openly admitting that his team referenced a Nazi-era study on phosgene toxicity when determining safe workplace exposure limits. According to him, there simply wasn't any other good human data available, and while he acknowledged the experiments obviously had a lot of flaws, the Nazi data still offered what he called a measure of improvement over what they had before. In other words, human-derived figures on dose-response thresholds gathered in the most horrific way imaginable ended up directly informing Cold War-era American safety standards. The report wasn't cited in peer-reviewed literature, it wasn't shouted from the rooftops, but behind closed doors in the halls of power, it absolutely was utilized. And the disease experiments, well, those too found their use. We've already seen what was done. The infections, the vaccines, the sheer brutality of it all. So let's look at what came after now. Because while most of that work belonged in the bin alongside its authors, some of it didn't stay buried. Some of it was reviewed, some of it was quietly cross-referenced in a few cases. Some of it slipped into circulation. Take malaria, for instance. The trials carried out at Dachau under Dr. Klaus Schilling were grotesque but detailed. Hundreds of prisoners were infected, some repeatedly, in a bid to test quinine derivatives and experimental antimalarials. And while Schilling's methods earned him a war crimes conviction and a death sentence, his data wasn't entirely discarded. According to internal records reviewed in A History of Concern, The Ethical Dilemma of Using Nazi Medical Research Data and Scientific Research by Ross Halpin, Schilling's work was analyzed by US Army medical officers after the war, even though it was never cited in open literature. No novel cure emerged, either from Schilling's hand or from those of US doctors, but the fever cures, dosage patterns, and drug interactions were read, evaluated, and at least temporarily kept. And we'll stop with the Nazi stuff here because frankly you get the idea by now. It was a shit show of horror, and somehow some of the shit stuck. Let's shift scenes now and have a look at the results of Japan's experiments, because guess what? It turns out the Japanese didn't just match the Nazis in their depravity, they also matched them in the depressing accidental efficacy and utility of their results. For example, they discovered that starving fleas for exactly 48 hours prior to release significantly increased their feeding aggression and subsequent plague transmission of efficacy, a finding that became pivotal to the successful development of Japan's first operational biological weapon, the plague bomb. The mechanism behind it was simple. Fleas that had not fed recently were far more desperate for a blood meal, and upon release, bit human hosts within minutes, injecting Yersinia pestis directly into the bloodstream. That's plague, by the way. This discovery, logged and refined through over a dozen controlled releases at the Ping Fang facility, was later weaponized via the ceramic UG bomb, a cluster-style ordnance designed to rupture midair and scatter a payload of roughly 30,000 infected fleas across urban targets. Just going out there and giving people plague. Jesus Christ. Kishore Johnson, writing in A Scientific Method to the Madness of Unit 731's Human Experimentation and Biological Warfare program, goes into God, the titles and academic stuff is always so long. Goes into detail about that latter point, explaining that during the October 1940 attack on Ningbo, plague mortality peaked precisely where such bombs were dropped. The bomb itself, he noted, also had to be ceramic, not metal, because the latter killed the fleas via thermal shock. He also noted that their deployment was meticulously calibrated too, in a way that was only possible thanks to the unit trials. Fleas were starved for 48 hours, as already stated, then loaded into the bomb casing within 12 hours of detonation, giving the operator plenty of wiggle room to wait for the perfect local atmospheric conditions before dropping them before the fleas started dropping dead from starvation. Sheldon Harris, in Factories of Death, Japanese Biological Warfare 1932 to 1945 and the American Cover-Up, had a lot to say about this, referring to it as a, quote, grotesque but effective entomological solution to a logistical challenge. He also noted that the Japanese eventually bred over 300 million fleas in plague-compatible rat hosts to fuel this delivery system's appetite. Moving beyond that, though, Johnson also notes how the Japanese discovered that when administering Vibrio cholerae through contaminated grain supplies, particularly wheat and millet, which retain moisture well, infection rates among civilians increased sharply compared to delivery via tainted water alone, because the foodborne route allowed for prolonged pathogen viability and delayed detection. Mario Marino, in Unit 731, Japan's Angels of Death, now that's a short title, further adds that this approach was refined by adjusting the grain's moisture content before distribution. They found that slightly damp wheat gave the bacteria a kind of protective cocoon, extending its infectious potential by as much as 72 hours after planting it in the field. They also discovered that Bacillus anthracis spores, when suspended in finely milled talcum powder rather than liquid culture, retained both structural integrity and infectious potential long enough to be deployed as a dry biological weapon with aerial dispersal capability, a major leap forward in open-air biowarfare logistics. Yeah, anthrax, really scary shit. Because it can last forever, it can be dry, you can just blow it up over an area and it's really, really deadly. Johnson, to come back to him, also happened to identify this in particular as one of the most rigorously tested innovations to emerge from the Pingfang complex, with extensive comparative trials proving that powdered anthrax not only clung more reliably to skin and clothing, but also produced a 40% higher rate of pulmonary infection in test subjects compared to liquid mediums. Wow, so not only was it easier to disperse, it is also worse. Harris clarified the matter even further by revealing that this finding came only after multiple failures involving aqueous anthrax dispersal, where ambient humidity and UV exposure rendered the bacteria inert before infection could take hold. The powdered form was also eventually mixed with inert rice husk and starch derivatives, yielding a sort of biodust that was tested by dropping it on tied prisoners within open-air cages, a process designed to simulate battlefield conditions. The optimum spore concentration was eventually settled at a 10 to the power of 8 colony-forming units per gram, a figure scribbled into one of the surviving planning sheets recovered by Soviet forces during their advance into Manchuria. As for the syphilis experiments, they discovered that congenital transmission from mother to fetus was not only possible but alarmingly efficient, with nearly 70% of infected pregnancies resulting in stillbirth or severe malformation, a figure meticulously recorded through repeated vivisections of pregnant test subjects in late-stage gestation. Kishore Johnson again notes that the Japanese researchers deliberately infected pregnant prisoners at varying points in their term to track the pathogen's progression across the placental barrier. We already know that, of course. What we don't know is the results. That infection within the first trimester was most likely to result in neurological defects or miscarriage, while second and third trimester infections often produced living infants with advanced stage syphilitic lesions. And coming back to Harris, he confirms that this data was viewed as clinically robust within the program and was later synthesized into unpublished post-war papers on perinatal pathology, some of which quietly circulated within Japanese medical universities in the 50s under the guise of standard epidemiological research. Now let's turn to the frostbite trials. The unit researchers found that tissue which had undergone full crystallization could only be salvaged if remorming was initiated within a tightly limited time frame, typically under 120 minutes, and conducted via immersion in water held precisely between 37.5 and 39 Celsius. Oh, I didn't realize that something was... Oh god, am I using this data? Am I finding this data interesting? That's so fucked up. But I did not realize that something that was fully crystallized could be warmed back up and useful. I thought once it was crystallized, it's done. Deviations outside this range, even by a few degrees, led to exponential increases in necrosis and nerve damage. They also observed that friction-based warming methods such as rubbing with cloth or exposure to dry heat routinely ruptured capillaries and caused blistering that masked deeper structural degradation. Additionally, they discovered that once a limb thawed, the presence or absence of pain was a reliable prognostic indicator. Those who screamed survived longer. Those who didn't usually lost the limb and sometimes their lives within 48 hours due to systemic collapse or sepsis. It's broader in scope, but you've got to admit, it does line up with the Nazi findings weirdly well, doesn't it? In the case of blood loss and shock, it emerged that the threshold for irreversible hemorrhagic collapse in a healthy adult male was roughly 40% of total blood volume lost within 20 minutes, a figure established through systematic exsanguination trials where flow rate, blood pressure, and organ responsiveness was tracked in real time. They discovered that beyond this threshold, even immediate transfusion failed to restore consciousness or cardiac stability in most subjects. Just to make it clear, we're talking about just stringing someone up and cutting them open and draining their blood out. Just because this all sounds oh so scientific, doesn't it? But you're just torturing people to death, again. Poking them with sticks, basically. However, if replacement fluids were administered before the 30% mark, survival rates jumped significantly, especially when the fluid used was warmed and isotonic. The trials also revealed that cooling the patient during the bleed, counterintuitive as it seemed, could delay the onset of shock by slowing metabolic demand although this only worked in the short term and complicated rewarming later. By running comparative autopsies, they mapped the order in which organ systems failed during terminal shock. Kidneys first, then the gut, finally the brainstem. When it came to chemical exposure, they determined that phosgene gas caused death not primarily through suffocation, but by inducing catastrophic pulmonary edema, fluid flooding the lungs so rapidly that blood oxygenation dropped to zero within minutes. The concentration threshold for this outcome, they discovered, was significantly lower when the gas was inhaled in humid conditions, as moisture accelerated the reaction in lung tissue. They also noted a distinct three-stage symptom profile: an initial cough and chest tightness, a deceptive asymptomatic interval of up to 30 minutes, and then a sudden collapse as the lungs filled. This delay, they concluded, made phosgene particularly effective for incapacitating troops without immediate alarm, a trait they considered ideal for battlefield deployment or sabotage. Their internal records recommend that gas be released in the early morning fog or in enclosed urban zones where the humidity would maximize lethality before dispersal. Post-mortem examinations further revealed that phosgene exposure did not cause visible damage to the upper airways, allowing the lungs to remain deceptively intact until filled, which meant that even medics misread the danger until it was far too late. And I think we'll end the discussion of what Japan discovered there, because while interesting in their own right to be sure, I'm less interested in your remembering the specifics than I am the overall vibe of it. Which is to say, actually, it turns out, and there's no nice way to dress this up, for all their abhorrent wickedness, the Japanese actually learned a lot from their human experimentation. And having said all of that, I now really need to come back to the point that I made at the beginning of this chapter, that being that actually useful results such as these need to be remembered as the shit that stuck to the wall while sitting atop a giant mound of turds that missed the mark and fell to earth with a splat. Yeah, and just again, the ends do not justify the means. It's a weird way to structure the chapter, I know, sandwiching the wider context as crusts rather than just putting it all at the end, and indeed, in a normal Decoding the Unknown, that is exactly what I would do, as dangling an incomplete answer before yanking the rod away and revealing the full truth of the matter certainly makes a piece more engaging. But here, today, with the subject matter we're covering being so important, I couldn't run the risk that those who dropped off before reaching this point might walk away thinking that those vile and horrific experiments had any more than the rock bottom and minimal scientific merit that they did. Thus, this is how the chapter stands right now. Yeah, good decision, George, I think, in my opinion. I think it's still structured nicely. That said, my apologies for some slight and necessary clunkiness. How and why should we temper our opinions when it comes to this data? To explain what I'm getting at, I'll pull from Berger's 1990 article again, as in it, he outlines how the Nazis' studies were total and complete methodological disasters. Basic experimentation controls, missing. Control groups, nope. Sample sizes, unspecified subject variables like age, health, clothing, and immersion depth, largely ignored. Temperature measurements were sporadic and tampered with, sometimes by assistants desperately trying to sabotage the trial to spare the victims' lives. Documentation was also vague and contradictory. Rasher, for example, would report one thing in his tables, then contradict it in the postscript. Even the physiological conclusions, the supposedly useful bits, have major issues. Rasher's team once reported, for instance, that water temperature had no impact on cooling rate, an absurd claim contradicted by basically every ethical hypothermia trial ever conducted. The descriptions of cardiac arrhythmias read like a drunk student's flashcards. Atrial flutter is mislabeled, ventricular fibrillation is omitted entirely, and there's a weird mix of colloquial and non-standard medical language suggesting either ignorance or apathy, and probably both. What you're left with isn't a data set, it's a shambles, a horror show of half-notes and misreadings, documented under duress by men who may have actively sabotaged their own experiments to save lives. This was not the work of genius corrupted. This was the work of mediocrities drunk on power, producing paperwork for promotion. That is very nicely put, George. And yet for all of those issues, some of it, when cross-referenced with ethically conducted studies and what was double and triple checked to the degree that it was ethically possible, had a smidge of validity and held a slither of utility. Human experimentation of this depth, as I'll call it, had simply never been done before, and neither has since, mercifully, and that alone makes the data useful in an objective sense. Should we use it? Okay, so now that we have happened upon the uncomfortable realization that actually, yes, some useful stuff was actually learned from World War II human experiments, a rather difficult question looms over us. Is it alright to use it? And in answering that, I gotta be real with you. A question like this is way over my intellectual pay grade. Yeah, Yes, same George. How far do you ask? Well, using the metaphor of physical height, picture all 5'11" of me stood, say, next to my house, and with it standing about 25 feet tall, still not quite far enough. Picture me beside the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building on Earth, and you'll find that despite it being 2,711 feet taller than me, you're still not quite there. Worry not though, because while I may be but a humble idiot, and a man accursed to walk the earth with a brain marked by smoothness akin to that of custard, think like Cain out of the Bible, but instead of immortality, I'm marked by stupidity. There, the reference there is like nice, because it's like, okay, yeah, like an intelligent reference as a way to describe a lack of intelligence. I think George is pretty smart, but this is just a really big question. There are many clever sorts out there, though, who have given the matter a lot of thought and whose brains are blessed by oh so many cavernous wrinkles. So what I can do instead, therefore, is assemble some of their thoughts together, gesture enthusiastically in their collected direction, and say, the answer's somewhere in there. Good luck, everybody. I don't know if there is an answer, though. And let us begin by doing exactly that by considering contemporary responses in the immediate wake of it all. In Germany, for example, as we saw back in Chapter 1, while many perpetrators ended up getting frustratingly short sentences, many did get sent to the rope for what they'd done, and so either way, a firm and clear standard in both legality and morality was established. And that was that it was very, very wrong. It was criminal, in fact. In Japan, however, well, that didn't happen. You see, my not mentioning the fate of the unit staff earlier, that wasn't a whoopsie-daisy on my part. They were all scuttled off to America or something, and they were all pardoned or whatever, in exchange for their data, which is fucking insane. No, I wanted to hold on to this very moment so that while discussing the matter of ethics and morality more broadly, I could reveal the fact that actually they basically got away with it, totally scot-free. Why? Well, in a nutshell, the data gathered proved to be so useful, and the people who had created it so proficient in their wicked fields, that the US couldn't help but saying, fuck the ethics of the matter. Uncle Sam want, Uncle Sam gets. As a result, and as historian Sheldon Harris put it, to come back to him, the American cover-up sacrificed justice for information. They knew full well in their hearts that the myriad of former military scientists they had given pardons to likely contained the most evil and reprehensible human beings to ever walk the face of the earth, but such was the Cold War. To them, suddenly now presented with a chance to get an edge over the new Soviet enemy, culpability, at least in the Far East, found itself as a tangible and trifling matter. And don't think I'm flinging shit at just the Americans here. The Soviets had the exact same convenient hypocrisy as their capitalist counterparts. But whereas the Americans had more of a no war criminals to see here, move along, the Soviets went more of a, mate, do you know how much justice I dished out? All of it. That's how much. You've never seen how much justice I dished out. Just trust me, bro. To explain what I mean, the Soviets did actually have a trial for the Japanese scientists they captured during their invasion of Manchuria, the Khabarovsk War Crimes Trial in 1949. And at their conclusion, all 12 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to hard labor at a gulag outside the city of Sverdlovsk. Sverdlovsk just happening to be where the Soviets were building a shiny new bioweapons research facility. Oh no, is their hard labor going to be bioweapons research? That's not why I want hard labor to be like pointlessly moving a pile of rocks from one location to another and then moving said pile back. Not working on fucking plague or something. That's not hard labor, that's just labor. So yes, in real terms, they got away with it too. But if you ask Moscow, they were found guilty at trial, so justice! For our purposes, the end result is the fact that in the aftermath of World War II, there wasn't a single unified moral stance on what to do with the data, at least not from the powers that be. Their words were absolutist condemnation, but their actions were those of pure pragmatists. Instead, then, let's not look towards governments to guide our moral takeaways, a lesson that, if anything, was the key one from World War II and the various regimes involved in it anyway, and instead turn to various clever and insightful individuals, starting with those who said absolutely not under any circumstances. This is, to break out one of the big philosophical words, the deontological view that there are some things for which the immorality of the matter is absolute, And so, as a result, once that line is crossed, everything else is irrelevant, and any good, if you can even call it such a thing, that may objectively be able to be panned out from the wickedness becomes a null and moot point. It is accursed and evil knowledge, so let it burn, just as the victims produced by penning it did. Now, the first person to hold this view is someone we've actually met before, Dr. Andrew Ivy, the very man who, with time, would speak openly about the potential utility of aspects of Rasher's experiments. You see, for him, said utility was merely a matter of objectivity, not any kind of endorsement or a call to action. And when he said he wished to collect the broader data, that was merely a point of academic curiosity. Actually using it for anything beyond that was a big no as far as he was concerned, with the evil manner in which it had been collected being the end of the matter. This view was shared by his colleague, Dr. Leo Alexander, who, along with Ivy, was instrumental in drafting the Nuremberg Code, a document that, as the name rather gives away, was produced during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg and prescribed the standards of ethics or code with which human experimentation could be ethically conducted going forward. Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't realize that a code... I mean, I guess it makes sense. I just thought that existed a code already and they horribly violated it. But they made a new one. And George has a CliffsNotes version. If I'm interested, I definitely am. Voluntary consent is essential. Yeah, number 1. The experiment should yield fruitful results for the good of society, and it must be necessary and not achievable by other means. It must be based on prior animal experimentation and knowledge of the disease or problem. Avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. No experiment should be conducted if there is reason to believe it could result in death or disabling injury. The degree of risk must never exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem being addressed. Subjects must be protected against even remote possibilities of death or injury with proper facilities and preparations. Conducted only by scientifically qualified persons, subjects must be free to quit at any time, and finally, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage. Yeah, like I said, as someone who's been involved in human experiments, the script about Nazi experimentation, that sounds bad, as the guinea pig, for money, completely voluntarily, this is all very much followed, and they are extremely strict about this shit. Like, the level of strictness in every one of these that I've ever done is extreme. Like, you sign forms, they explain things to you. They're constantly asking, do you understand? Do you know what's going on? It's like, yes, Jesus Christ, yes, just give me the drug and then pay me. So yes, when that was their standard for how things should be done, it's hardly surprising that both Drs. Alexander and Ivy found Nazi human experimentation so repugnant that they considered any knowledge gained from it intrinsically illicit and beyond absolution. I gotta say too, as much as I'm keeping my own personal opinions to myself in this chapter, a shout out and big love to the good doctors for that code, because as a man who regularly gets pumped full of all manner of experimental drugs, because as a self-employed remote worker who firmly believes that money can buy happiness, doing so allows me to boost my income without impeding my day job one bit. I'm rather grateful for it. Wait, George, are you doing this? This is exactly what I did. Oh, wow. Oh, that's awesome. It's so well paid, and all you got to do, like, what I did, and this was like back in the day, so money is more. I think it must have been around 2008. I was at university. Yeah, so around 2008. And I sat in hospital for like 3 weeks, and then they wrote me a check for like $3,500. And all you do is you sit there, and there's video games, and I had a laptop, and I just watched like DVDs. And yeah, if I had a job, if I had work, I'd be working. I'd be double dipping. Bringing it back to the matter at hand, however, not everyone who stands firm against the use of Nazi or Japanese data does so with procedural or professional influences informing their opinion. For many, it's just that base moral instinct and resulting moral revulsion alone that forms the opinion that using such data would be an act akin to dancing on the graves of its victims. Take Baruch Cohen, a legal scholar who studied this issue in forensic detail and published his musings in a 1990 paper titled The Ethics of Using Medical Data from Nazi Experiments. He argued that using data wrenched so brutally from helpless victims would make us moral accessories to the crimes themselves. Not just bystanders, not just opportunists, complicit. To take that information and use it, he warned, is to turn the murdered into retrospective guinea pigs, subjects once more in the cold service of science. The killing might be done, but the exploitation would live on. And as much as I don't want to drown you in a barrage of unending quotes, I would like to say that in reading Cohen's paper, you get the sense that he is a deeply empathetic fellow, and that his empathy is the keystone of his perspective on the matter. And I mean, can you blame him? Cast your mind back to Eva Moses, who we met earlier, who, if you recall, was one of the few survivors of Mengele's twin experiments. To help get where Cohen was coming from, she was a woman who knew exactly what it was like to have her being reduced to mere data. It meant being poked, prodded, infected, measured and mutilated, all without consent and all without compassion, only to face disposal afterwards as little more than bio-waste. Would you be able to look her in the eye and start making a utilitarian argument for the proactive use of what tiny scraps of useful data came from World War II human experimentation? In fact, we could up the ante because there is one period photo of her taken immediately after Auschwitz liberation by the Soviets. Front and center there she is, the very same little girl who survived torture by internally screaming, "I must survive," over and over again. You look at her and tell me, yes or no, should it or shouldn't it be used? Lord Emanuel Jacobitz, the former chief rabbi of Britain and a towering figure in Jewish medical ethics, certainly didn't think so. For him, using the data would be simple desecration. The value of human life, he believed, is not something you can weigh against a line graph or a statistical insight harvested from the dying. I mean, I'm not gonna be able to figure out what the right thing here is, but you can value human life. People do it. It's done all the time. Like, it's a strange argument to me where people are like, oh, you can't put a price on human life. And it's like, well, yeah, you can. It's done all the time by tons of groups and government bodies and all of that. It's like, well, how much insurance companies, actuaries, like all this stuff is like, well, okay, that's the value. And courts do it. Like, someone dies, someone gets sued. The courts are like, well, that's the value. There you go. Not punitive damages, and then the non-punitive damages, right? The ones that aren't to punish the company, the ones that are like, that's the value of that person's life. Even in the realm of secular science, this view found strong voices. Dr. Henry Beecher, I don't think this is necessarily anything to do with religion. This is to do with ethics. A big difference, in my opinion. You don't need religion. It doesn't need to be secular, non-secular for ethics to apply. Dr. Henry Beecher, a leading Harvard ethicist and anesthesiologist, for example, made it clear in his 1966 paper, Ethics in Clinical Research, that he does not believe the ends can ever justify the means. Publishing or relying on data extracted through torture or coercion, he warned, would inflict a far-reaching moral loss to medicine itself. It would corrode the trust between doctor and patient, poison the integrity of research, and hollow out the very soul of scientific endeavor. And that's the hard wall of the dentological argument. Never again as a slogan, but as a doctrine, a belief that evil knowledge, like radioactive waste, can't be scrubbed clean, only buried. No ifs, no buts, no whatabouts. And since I suspect I've low-key given away my stance despite my attempts to remain Mr. Neutral Purveyor of other people's opinions in this chapter, I may as well come out and say it. This is not a take I find disagreeable. Absolutely not. Like, I don't know quite where I fall on this, because I think, well, you've got the argument, which has been made here so far, that you shouldn't use this data because the ends don't justify the means. However, the data is there. The ends don't justify the means, no, but that doesn't exclude the fact that the data is sitting there. Some of it is useful. Is it not, I don't quite know how to phrase this without sounding like, I don't know, like ethically bankrupt. But if I had been frozen to death by a monster and some useful data was gleaned from that, would I rather that ethical people 100 years later are using that data in ethical ways to make people's lives better? And I don't know, because it's impossible to put yourself in that situation, but I think my answer would be yes, with about 1,000 caveats that I'm probably not thinking of, but I think my answer would be yes, I'd be okay with that. In fact, I think I would prefer that, right? I don't know. I definitely don't find the argument that it should never be used disagreeable, though, certainly not. The raw guttural feeling I got while researching and writing this piece, half burning visceral hate for those who orchestrated it, half gut-wrenching sympathy for its victims, is simply not a feeling I can ignore or overlook. So yes, I can totally get why people would take this flat no, various reasons stance. Of course, not everyone sees this issue as purely black and white, never ever terms. And to the utilitarians, those who argue that if some scrap of knowledge gleaned from these atrocities could save lives or advance medicine, then maybe, just maybe, it should be used for the greater good. Their rationale is straightforward. Why let data gathered at such a terrible price go to waste if it might help someone? Bioethicist Arthur Kaplan summarizes this grim calculus bluntly. Would we rather let people die in the present than taint ourselves by using data from the past? This perspective isn't just theoretical too. In the 1980s, Pozos, who we already met more than once today, argued that data is neither evil nor good, but exists independently of the methods by which it was gathered, and that ethics and science are not linked. Accordingly, he proposed that from a purely scientific point of view, if one believes the data to be accurate, it is appropriate to use it. He wasn't alone in that opinion too. He had allies like Dr. John Hayward, a Canadian scientist. Their argument hinged on the uniqueness of the opportunity and the irreversibility of the situation. Nazi experiments had produced certain extreme data points, for example, how long an unanesthetized human could survive in near-freezing water, that ethical science could never replicate. If that data was unique, why not use it to potentially save pilots or shipwrecked sailors from hypothermic death? It's not like boycotting the data is going to bring the victims back, as they saw it. Some go further, suggesting that the data might even honor the victims in a strange posthumous way. Yeah, that's what I was kind of saying. Like, doing the impossible task of trying to put yourself in the shoes there. A kind of redemptive ad hoc justification. Woof! Steady. I'm not sure I'd go that far. For example, Sarah Wilson toys, but does not explicitly endorse the notion that, quote, now that the Holocaust is in the past, no one can do anything to prevent the cruelty. Perhaps, now that the data exists, the greatest happiness would be to use it so that others may benefit in spite of the evil that helped cause the data. Maybe saving lives by using the data can begin to redeem the Holocaust deaths in a small way. And I'm fully dropping the neutral veneer to chime in on this again, folks, because I've got some thoughts on this one. Ooh, I get the feeling like I think the best way for me to describe this would be to talk about how George described the previous one. I don't find it disagreeable. Am I very much in the minority here? I don't find it disagreeable. Make no mistake, I can see what's trying to be said, but alas, us humans aren't solely creatures of logic. And as a result, when I open the floodgates on my emotions so that they can blend together with my logic and produce my fully rounded opinion, the resulting soup comes out as a firm no, and just to be fucking clear, no. I guess I don't know, what's the side of the brain that's very logical, because that's what my brain is. I'm a logical machine. Like I say, however, I see the logic, so I think no lesser of anyone who does have this takeaway. But for me, the second the words redeem, thee, and Holocaust are combined together in a sentence, even in a way which was clearly well-intentioned, I'm out. I'm going to come back to Jewish theological perspectives now too, because, of course, they are not monolithic on this point. In Judaism, for example, the concept of pikauch, nefesh, or saving a life is of paramount importance. So much so that it overrides almost any religious law. This has led some Orthodox authorities to conclude that if Nazi-derived data could genuinely save lives, it should be permissible to use, albeit with solemn precautions. We can see this applied in the discourse around Pernkopf Anatomy, the Atlas of Topographic and Applied Human Anatomy. This is an anatomical atlas which was originally published in 1937 by Eduard Pernkopf. It is a work which is nothing short of totemic, as it remains very heavily used to this day. One problem, however, Pernkopf was Austrian and a big old Nazi, so guess where many believe the corpses featured in his book came from? Yup. However, when commenting on the morality of its continued use, given that both Rabbi Joseph Perlach and Dr. Michael Grodin jointly concluded most Jewish authorities would allow the use of the images to save human lives under the condition the history of the atlas was made known, so the victims were afforded some of the dignity they are owed. In other words, use it, but never whitewash where it came from. Echoing this, an observant Jewish scientist named Velva Green admitted that he had known of the Nazi research earlier in his career. Had he known of the Nazi research earlier in his career, quote, I have no doubt I would have cited the Nazi data, looked for more, and used it to further his work. It's worth stating too that the utilitarians do acknowledge that raw no feeling that I described in myself, and although I'm not sure this doesn't need to be said outright, there's no harm being absolutely clear. They do not condone the methods by which the data was obtained. No, I mean, you don't need to say that. That's not what utilitarianism is here. Rather, they argue that the deed is done, we cannot undo it, and the victims are long dead. As one often cited commentary asked pointedly, should the data be buried? Or could using it actually prevent future suffering? It's a classic ends versus means question, and the utilitarian camp is willing to hold its nose and say that sometimes, yes, the ends justify the means. No, I'm sorry, I don't think that's what's being said here, George. I quite disagree with this. They're not saying the ends justify the means, they're saying the means already happened, so should we take the ends? They're not saying, oh no, it's justified. Am I missing something here? They're not saying that. They're saying like it's already happened. There's no additional harm caused, maybe benefit caused by using by using the ends, because the means has happened. One advisor to the US Army bluntly told his superiors in the 1950s that data from Japan's Unit 731 could be very valuable to US forces, effectively saying, oh, it'd be stupid not to use it. The Cold War American military evidently agreed. Don't forget, they struck a secret immunity for data deal with Unit 731's perpetrators, valuing bacteriological data over prosecuting war crimes. Now that's where I draw a fucking line. Like, that is, you could still punish these people and you didn't. And that is outrageous. In their calculus, national security and gaining a scientific edge over the Soviets won out over moral scruples. Uncle Sam wanted the data, and so the data he got. It's not just the military who have put the utilitarian interpretation into practice, as civilians have done it too. In 1989, officials at the US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, were quietly weighing whether to use Nazi gas chamber data to set safety limits for phosgene, a lethal chemical. Nazi doctors had force-exposed prisoners to phosgene, of course, and meticulously noted the lethal concentrations. As a result, some EPA scientists suggested that since human data is so hard to come by, these ghastly findings could fill an important gap. After all, wouldn't more accurate regulations save lives around chemical plants? By a strictly utilitarian logic, it was hard to deny that if the Nazi data were accurate, it might indeed help to do exactly that. To me, I guess it's because of that, logical brain. The utilitarianism does appeal to me. Who's the utilitarian? Is it Kant, the big utilitarian guy who kind of came up with this stuff? I took one philosophy course at university. Well, not philosophy. It wasn't even philosophy. It was ethics. And I remember that being a big thing. I remember being quite like utilitarianism. My logical brain. What's the Spock thing? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. I hope that was Spock and not Kant. Examples such as that do tend to be the exception rather than the norm, however, at least in the civilian space, as the answer is usually a firm no. To explain how that consensus was reached, we have to turn back to Beecher once again, as it was actually his paper, Ethics and Clinical Research, that got the conversation started. And with the door on that matter having been opened, one by one, serious institutions started implementing their own formalized NOPE policies. For example, the New England Journal soon decreed that anything that contained even so much as a bibliographic citation of World War II human experimentation data would not be considered for publication, ever. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, a small working group of medical journal editors who work together to codify publishing standards and norms across the sector, followed suit too, adopting the same standard not long after, and so on and so forth, until it basically became the norm. And yet the academic consensus, clearly, as we have seen, is not the consensus. And so we're left with a situation where on one side lies the uncompromising stance that such data is irredeemable, evil knowledge, like radioactive waste, it must be sealed away forever, and on the other side is the argument that, like it or not, that data exists, and refusing to even look at it could be seen as a failure of our duty to save lives or advance understanding. Which side is right ultimately? I don't know. Don't forget, this stuff is way over my intellectual pay grade.
I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
Fortunately, however, I know one man whose brains lack not for wrinkles, and he's currently reading you these very words. No, it's also over my pay grade, George. I think we're probably on the same pay grade, George. Your pay grade's probably higher than mine. So, Simon, what do you think? Where do you stand on this moral quagmire? I think I've elucidated my thoughts a little bit as we've gone through the script. And I don't know if I've got anything particularly more to add, really, than my half-baked thoughts as we went through. Yeah. Anyway. Not everyone agrees. And so, following Simon's no doubt incredibly wise words, we're coming towards the end of the episode today. Before I close things off, however, and very much in the continued spirit of my being terrified of getting something wrong today, I just wanted to discuss something that has likely become apparent to many of you by now. The fact that actually, it turns out this topic is a fucking nightmare to navigate. Not for the morality of the matter, no, but instead for the fact that the scholarly sources just cannot actually seem to reach a consensus one way or another on whether anything was actually usefully gained from the experiments to begin with. It is a methodological minefield, and some sources can't even seem to agree with themselves, never mind each other. Take Robert Berger's landmark 1990 article in the New England Journal of Medicine to begin my explanation. He performs a methodical, line-by-line demolition of the Dachau hypothermia experiments, concluding that they're so riddled with contradictions, sloppiness, and probable fabrication that they should be thrown out entirely. In his words, they, quote, have all the ingredients of a scientific fraud, end quote, and cannot, in good faith, be said to, quoting again, advance science or save lives. And yet other respected researchers, sometimes in the very same breath as agreeing with Berger, argue that the data has been useful. Take Robert Pozos. He concedes that the data is deeply flawed, but insists that some of it may still hold value if reviewed cautiously and cross-referenced against ethical studies. But he simultaneously calls Berger's dismissal fair and maintains that the major findings haven't been scientifically debunked. Depending on which paragraph you read him in, he can seemingly have totally contrary opinions. Andrew Ivy's even worse. In 1947, for example, he called the data medically worthless. By 1954, he was calling it very worthwhile and wishing to catalogue it for academic curiosity. Scholars have tried to explain this away as the product of political compromise, Cold War priorities, or academic vanity. But it still stands as a whiplash-inducing reversal from a key moral authority of the post-war trials. Also, I just said people are allowed to change their mind. They're allowed to change their morals and their ethics and how they feel about things over time, just from thinking about it. My moral stance on loads of issues has changed over time. I'm certain. I think it's a good thing to be able to change your mind and change how you think about things. Be weird if you don't. Then there are people like John Hayward who openly admit the data is tainted, but argue that its sheer uniqueness makes it hard to ignore. I don't want to use it, he said, but there is no other, and there will be no other in an ethical world. The implication being, if no other human experiment will ever ethically replicate the extremity of what the Nazis did, then maybe, just maybe, some of it has to be used cautiously, quietly, almost shamefully. And the use of it, of course, implies that it has some scientific value. Even major institutional publications can't seem to commit. The US Army's own textbook on military medical ethics acknowledges that hypothermia data from Dachau was consulted by aviation medicine experts after the war. Yet the very same book states outright that the experiments violated all principles of scientific rigor. The contradiction isn't just tolerated, it's printed side by side. It's like an open wound in the literature. This fractured consensus creates an absolute nightmare for the humble idiot whose words you're currently hearing. All I wanted to do was go on a deep dive that could be equal parts commemorative as it was informative about what is, in all likelihood, the single darkest chapter in medical history. Long-term fans of not only this channel, but the Whistlerverse more broadly, have likely ascertained by this point that I hold both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in quite the low regard. And so the last thing I wanted to do was relay their history incorrectly to you, or worse still, end up playing up into the very type of accidental denialism that I denigrated in my boomerism tangent. With that said, and in the spirit of transparency, how did I end up navigating this historical clusterfuck, especially when I make no attempt to hide my own intellectual shortcomings? Well, in a nutshell, I put my faith in quantity. When crafting the So What Was Actually Learned chapter, I just presented the narrative that appears the most often, which of course is the fuck, turns out they actually did learn some things one. If this turns out to be wrong, I can only apologize, but among the dozens of works I gathered on my hard drive for this piece, the most heavily weighted conclusion was readily apparent. All I could do was trust both my gut and my skills as a researcher, and in the end, that's what I did. So there you have it, folks. A deep dive into a topic so bleak, so viscerally depressing, and so morally mangled that I now find myself wondering why I ever suggested it in the first place. George, I couldn't agree more. It took me 3 days to record this. I had to have breaks, I had to go home, because it's just such a misery. Don't get me wrong, this is important history. Vital even. So I'm glad we covered it, but it does leave me asking the same question I always seem to arrive at after these kinds of topics. Why can't I ever research anything nice? So with that in mind, fuck it, on my next episode, expect me to write a Decoding the Unknown along the lines of just how nice is Keanu Reeves? This is why corgis are the cutest dogs, or the tax-deductible business expense scandal. Just how luxurious of a time can one man have on holiday? Till then, I'm out. Indeed, thank you, George.